Welcome, guardian of Gotham's shadows, to a journey through the deepest darkness that dwells within the heart of the city that never sleeps peacefully. Tonight, we shall explore the most heinous acts committed by those twisted souls who have made Batman's mission not just necessary, but sacred. In the Gothic spires and shadowed alleyways where madness takes root and evil flourishes, we will trace the worst crimes ever perpetrated by the rogues who call Gotham home. Close your eyes, keeper of secrets, and let these tales of ultimate corruption and profound tragedy wash over you like the eternal fog that cloaks the city's sins. In the pantheon of criminal madness that has plagued Gotham City throughout its dark and storied history, no figure looms larger or casts a shadow more terrible than the grinning spectre of chaos known as the Joker. His story begins not with the maniacal laughter that would become his signature, but with the desperate gasps of a man drowning in his own failures, a comedian whose jokes fell flat in dingy clubs where hope went to die and dreams were buried beneath the weight of urban decay and economic desperation. The man who would become the clown prince of crime was once known by a different name, though history has mercifully obscured those details beneath layers of chemical transformation and psychological dissolution. What we know is that he was ordinary once, possessed of the same small aspirations and mundane fears that characterize millions of lives lived in quiet desperation. He wanted to make people laugh, to bring joy to a world that seemed determined to crush such simple pleasures beneath the grinding machinery of survival and compromise. The comedy clubs of Gotham's East End were harsh proving grounds where talent was less important than the ability to endure humiliation, where audiences came not to be entertained but to participate in the ritual destruction of those foolish enough to believe they had something worth sharing. Night after night, he climbed onto stages that might as well have been altars of sacrifice, offering up his dignity and self-respect in exchange for the fleeting possibility that someone, anyone, might find meaning in his words. The failure that drove him to accept the job that would destroy his humanity was not dramatic or sudden, but rather the slow accumulation of empty rooms, hostile crowds, and bills that demanded payment regardless of artistic integrity or creative vision. His pregnant wife needed medical care that his meager earnings from legitimate comedy could not provide, and the criminal organization that approached him with their proposition understood exactly how to exploit the desperation that poverty and love create when they intersect in the wrong circumstances at the wrong time. The Red Hood Gang was among Gotham's most notorious criminal enterprises, their trademark scarlet helmet serving both as disguise and symbol of the blood they were willing to spill in pursuit of their goals. The job they offered the failed comedian was simple in concept yet terrifying in execution. He would wear the hood for a single night, lead them through the chemical plant where he had once worked as an engineer, and help them rob the facility of valuable industrial compounds that could be sold to other criminals or corrupt corporations. The irony that would later seem almost cosmically appropriate was that the plant they intended to rob was the Ace Chemical Processing Facility, a location where dangerous substances were refined and purified for industrial use, where the boundary between creation and destruction was measured in molecular concentrations and safety protocols. The man who had spent years trying to create laughter would instead help create the conditions for his own rebirth as an agent of chaos and horror. The heist went wrong from the moment it began, as such desperate ventures inevitably do when they are planned by amateurs and executed by the desperate. The security systems that the inside information had promised would be easily circumvented proved more sophisticated than anticipated, while the guards who should have been distracted or absent were alert and well armed. The comedy of errors that followed would have been amusing if it had not involved real bullets and genuine terror. The pursuit that drove the Red Hood through the facility's labyrinthine corridors was relentless and merciless. with security forces and police converging from multiple directions to trap the criminals in an industrial maze where every wrong turn could lead to capture or death. The other gang members fell one by one, their bodies adding to the facility's grim history of industrial accidents and workplace violence, leaving the comedian alone with his scarlet disguise and his growing certainty that he would not survive the night. The moment that would transform him forever came when he found himself cornered on a catwalk high above the chemical processing vats, with armed pursuers closing in from behind, and nothing but a deadly fall into industrial waste ahead of him. The choice he faced was between certain death at the hands of law enforcement and probable death in the churning chemical bath below, yet something in his failing comedian's brain convinced him that the chemicals offered at least the possibility of survival. The plunge into the chemical vat was both an ending and a beginning, a death that gave birth to something unprecedented in the annals of human psychology and criminal behavior. The industrial compounds that should have dissolved flesh and bone instead worked a transformation that was part accident, part miracle, and entirely horrible. The man who had wanted to make people laugh emerged from that chemical baptism as something that would make them scream. The physical changes were immediately apparent and permanently disfiguring. Skin bleached to a chalk, white pallor that no amount of makeup or medical intervention could restore, hair transformed to an unnatural green that seemed to glow with its own internal light, and most disturbing of all, lips stretched into a permanent rictus grin that made every expression appear maniacal regardless of his actual emotional state. Yet these visible alterations were merely the surface manifestation of deeper psychological changes that would prove far more dangerous than any physical deformity. The chemical bath had not merely changed his appearance, but had shattered the psychological structures that normally govern human behavior and emotional response. The barriers between thought and action, between impulse and consequence, between sanity and madness, all dissolved along with his original identity in those churning industrial vats. What emerged was something that psychiatrists would study for decades without ever fully understanding. A consciousness freed from the normal constraints of empathy, guilt, and moral consideration. The laughter that became his trademark was not born of joy or even madness in any conventional sense, but rather from the terrible clarity that came with the recognition that existence was essentially meaningless, that the carefully constructed social contracts and moral frameworks that governed human behavior were merely elaborate jokes played upon those too naive or frightened to recognize their fundamental absurdity. If life was a joke, then he would be both comedian and punchline, delivering truth through chaos and revelation through destruction. The transformation from failed comedian to criminal mastermind was not immediate, but rather evolved through a series of increasingly audacious crimes that tested the boundaries of both his own capabilities and society's ability to respond to threats that operated outside normal criminal parameters. His early schemes were relatively simple exercises in applied chaos theory, demonstrations that the order people took for granted was far more fragile than they imagined, and could be shattered by someone willing to ignore the rules that kept civilization functioning. The psychology that drove the Joker's criminal career was fundamentally different from that of traditional criminals who were motivated by greed, revenge, or desire for power. His crimes were performances, elaborate jokes designed to expose the absurdity of the systems and institutions that people trusted to protect them from exactly the kind of chaos he represented. Every robbery was a satire of capitalism. Every murder, a commentary on the random nature of mortality. Every elaborate scheme, a philosophical argument conducted through violence and terror. The relationship between the Joker and Batman that would define both their existences began with their first encounter, when the Dark Knight's investigation into a series of bizarre crimes led him to confront something unlike any criminal he had previously faced. Where other villains could be understood through conventional psychological analysis and criminal profiling, the Joker presented a puzzle that defied solution because it was based on the rejection of the very frameworks that made puzzles solvable. The dynamic that emerged from their early confrontations was less that of hero and villain than of order and chaos, meaning and meaninglessness, hope and despair, engaged in eternal conflict. Batman represented the belief that tragedy could be transformed into purpose, that suffering could be channeled into protection of others, that even in a universe that often seemed random and cruel, individual choices could create islands of meaning and justice. The Joker embodied the opposite philosophy, that meaning was illusion, that morality was pretense, and that the only honest response to existence was to embrace its essential absurdity. Yet beneath this cosmic conflict lay something more personal and more terrible. The Joker's growing obsession with Batman as the one person who might be capable of understanding his perspective yet refused to accept it. The Dark Knight's unwavering commitment to preserving life and maintaining hope in the face of overwhelming evidence of human cruelty and cosmic indifference both fascinated and infuriated the Clown Prince of Crime, who saw in his nemesis the ultimate challenge to his nihilistic worldview. The escalation of their conflict was inevitable, driven by the Joker's need to prove his philosophical point through increasingly elaborate and personal attacks designed to break Batman's spirit and force him to acknowledge the fundamental meaninglessness of his mission. Each scheme became more targeted, more psychological, more designed to exploit the specific vulnerabilities that the villain had identified through careful study of his opponent's methods and motivations. The crime that would forever cement the Joker's reputation as the most dangerous and depraved criminal in Gotham's history began as another philosophical experiment, another attempt to prove that heroism was simply another delusion that would crumble when subjected to sufficient pressure. Yet this particular experiment would cross lines that even the Joker had previously respected, entering territory that transformed him from a dangerous criminal into something approaching pure evil incarnate. The target he selected for his most ambitious lesson in meaninglessness was not Batman himself, for the villain had learned that direct attacks on the Dark Knight were ultimately futile and counterproductive. Instead, he chose to strike at something far more vulnerable and far more capable of inflicting the kind of psychological damage that could break even the strongest will: the family that Batman had created to help him in his mission, and to prove that trust and love could survive even in Gotham's darkness. Jason Todd had been the second young man to take up the mantle of Robin, following in the footsteps of Dick Grayson, who had grown beyond the role and established his own heroic identity as Nightwing. Where his predecessor had been acrobatic grace and natural leadership, Jason brought a different energy to the partnership. Street-smart aggression, born of harsh experience, righteous anger at injustice that sometimes threatened to overwhelm his judgment, and a fierce loyalty that made him willing to take risks that more cautious individuals might avoid. The psychological profile that the Joker developed through careful observation and research revealed Jason's particular vulnerabilities. His need to prove himself worthy of the Robin title, his anger at the criminal elements that had destroyed his early life, and most importantly, his genuine love for Batman as both mentor and father figure. These qualities that made him an effective crime fighter also made him the perfect victim for a scheme designed to inflict maximum psychological damage on the Dark Knight. The elaborate plan that the Joker devised to capture and torment the second Robin involved months of preparation, careful manipulation of criminal networks, and the kind of patient stalking that characterized his most successful schemes. He studied Jason's patterns, identified his preferred methods and locations for solo investigations, and gradually constructed a trap so sophisticated that even Batman's training and protective instincts would be insufficient to prevent its successful execution. The kidnapping itself was accomplished through a combination of deception, overwhelming force, and exploitation of Jason's own heroic nature. The Joker created a scenario that appeared to require immediate intervention to save innocent lives, knowing that the young Robin's sense of justice would compel him to act, even when prudence suggested waiting for backup or conducting further reconnaissance. The moment Jason committed himself to the rescue attempt, he walked into a carefully prepared killing ground where resistance was futile and escape was impossible. The location where the Joker chose to conduct his experiment was an abandoned warehouse in one of Gotham's most desolate industrial districts, a place where screams would go unheard and where the abandoned urban landscape would muffle any sounds of violence or distress. The building itself became part of the torture apparatus, its empty spaces echoing with sounds of pain and fear, its broken windows letting in just enough light to illuminate the horror within, while maintaining the oppressive atmosphere of abandonment and despair. The psychological torture that preceded the physical abuse was carefully designed to break down Jason's mental defenses and transform his natural courage into despair and helplessness. The Joker understood that simply inflicting pain, however severe, would not achieve his ultimate goal of demonstrating the meaninglessness of heroism and the futility of hope. Instead, he needed to make his victim complicit in his own destruction, to force him to acknowledge that his faith in Batman and in the possibility of justice was misplaced. The conversations that took place during the days of captivity revealed the Joker's sophisticated understanding of human psychology and his ability to identify and exploit the specific fears and insecurities that governed individual behavior. He spoke to Jason not as a generic victim, but as a specific person whose history, relationships, and aspirations he had studied with the thoroughness of a dedicated scholar preparing a dissertation on human suffering. The physical torture that accompanied these psychological assaults was methodical and progressive, designed not to kill quickly, but to inflict maximum suffering while maintaining the victim's consciousness and awareness of his situation. The Joker employed techniques borrowed from military interrogation, criminal enforcement, and medical knowledge to create pain that was both unbearable and precisely controlled, ensuring that his victim remained alert and responsive throughout the ordeal. The crowbar that became the primary instrument of torture was chosen not for its efficiency as a weapon, but for its symbolic value as a tool of destruction rather than creation. Where hammers built and wrenches repaired, the crowbar existed primarily to tear apart what others had constructed, making it the perfect metaphor for the Joker's relationship with the ordered world that Batman sought to protect. Each blow delivered with that simple tool was both physical assault and philosophical statement. The photographs and video recordings that the Joker created during his torture sessions served multiple purposes beyond simple documentation of his crimes. These images were intended as psychological weapons to be used against Batman, proof that his protective methods had failed and that his trust in others had led directly to their suffering. More insidiously, they were designed to create lasting trauma that would poison every subsequent relationship the Dark Knight attempted to form. The revelation that the Joker had not simply captured and killed Robin, but had tortured him systematically over an extended period, added layers of horror that transformed a tragic crime into something approaching the diabolical. The knowledge that Jason had suffered not just death but prolonged agony, not just defeat but psychological destruction, created wounds in Batman's psyche that would never fully heal and would influence every subsequent decision about involving others in his mission. The method chosen for Jason's final execution demonstrated the Joker's flair for dramatic irony and his understanding of how to maximize the psychological impact of his crimes. Rather than simply killing his victim directly, He arranged circumstances that would force Batman to choose between saving Jason and preventing the deaths of potentially hundreds of innocent people in a terrorist attack that would occur simultaneously across the city. The timer that counted down to the explosion was set with mathematical precision to ensure that even Batman's superhuman dedication and efficiency would be insufficient to accomplish both objectives. The Joker had studied his opponent's capabilities and response times carefully enough to create a scenario where heroic effort would be not just unsuccessful but counterproductive, where the very qualities that made Batman great would contribute to his failure to save someone he loved. The warehouse explosion that ended Jason Todd's life was visible from miles away, a fireball that lit up Gotham's industrial district like a second sun, and announced to everyone who witnessed it that something momentous and terrible had occurred. The destruction was complete and final, leaving no possibility of last-minute rescue or miraculous survival. No room for the kind of hope that had sustained Batman through previous tragedies and defeats. The aftermath of Jason's death created ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate grief and trauma experienced by those who had known and loved him. The second Robin's murder served as a watershed moment in Batman's war against crime, fundamentally altering his methods and relationships, while providing the Joker with a victory so complete and devastating that it would sustain his sense of philosophical vindication for years to come. The guilt that consumed Batman in the wake of his failure to save Jason was not simply the normal grief response that follows the death of a loved one, but rather a systematic destruction of the psychological foundations upon which his entire mission was built. The knowledge that his decision to involve young people in his war against crime had led directly to the torture and murder of someone he considered a son, challenged his fundamental assumptions about justice, protection, and the acceptable costs of heroic action. The changes in Batman's behavior following Jason's death were immediately apparent to those who worked with him regularly. His methods became harsher. His willingness to risk others' safety decreased dramatically, and his tendency toward isolation increased as he struggled to process guilt that threatened to overwhelm even his legendary determination. The joy and hope that had characterized his partnership with Robin was replaced by grim efficiency that served his mission but diminished his humanity. The Joker's satisfaction with the success of his experiment was evident in his subsequent crimes, which displayed a confidence and philosophical certainty that had been absent from his earlier schemes. He had proven to his own satisfaction that heroism was indeed meaningless, that love and trust were weaknesses to be exploited, and that chaos would ultimately triumph over any attempt to create lasting order or meaning in a fundamentally absurd universe. Yet perhaps the most terrible aspect of Jason Todd's murder was not the immediate suffering it caused, but the way it demonstrated the Joker's evolution from criminal to something approaching a force of nature. This was not a crime committed for money, power, or even personal revenge, but rather an act of philosophical terrorism designed to prove a point about the nature of existence itself. The young Robin had died not because of anything he had done or failed to do, but simply because his suffering and death served as effective arguments in a cosmic debate about meaning and meaninglessness. The investigation that followed the warehouse explosion revealed the meticulous planning and psychological sophistication that had gone into the crime, confirming Batman's growing understanding that his greatest enemy was not simply a criminal, but something far more dangerous. A prophet of nihilism whose message was delivered through violence, and whose congregation consisted of anyone willing to embrace despair over hope, chaos over order, meaninglessness over the difficult work of creating meaning in an indifferent universe. The trial that never took place, because the Joker was found to be legally insane, and was committed to Arkham Asylum rather than sentenced to death or life imprisonment, raised uncomfortable questions about society's ability to respond appropriately to crimes that transcended normal categories of criminal behavior. How could legal systems designed to address conventional motivations like greed or passion deal with someone whose actions were motivated by abstract philosophical principles and whose goals were measured in psychological rather than material terms? The legacy of Jason Todd's murder extended far beyond the immediate impact on Batman and the Joker to influence an entire generation of heroes who came of age, knowing that good intentions and heroic training were not sufficient. Protection against enemies who were willing to cross any line and break any taboo in service of their twisted goals. The second Robin's death served as a reminder that heroism was not a game or adventure, but a deadly serious commitment that could exact the ultimate price from those brave enough or foolish enough to accept its responsibilities. In the broader context of Gotham's criminal history, the torture and murder of Jason Todd represented a turning point that divided the city's experience into before and after. Innocence and experience, hope, and the knowledge that some evils were so profound that they could never be fully defeated or overcome. The Joker had achieved something that no previous criminal had accomplished. He had struck a blow against the very concept of heroism itself, proving that even the most dedicated and capable protectors could be made to fail in ways that would haunt them for the remainder of their lives. The philosophical implications of this crime continue to reverberate through every subsequent encounter between Batman and the Joker, creating a subtext of personal trauma and cosmic significance that elevates their conflict beyond simple law enforcement into the realm of mythology and moral instruction. In killing Jason Todd, the Clown Prince of Crime had not simply committed murder, but had launched an assault on the foundations of meaning itself, forcing anyone who witnessed or learned about his actions to confront fundamental questions about the nature of good and evil, the possibility of justice, and the price that heroes must be willing to pay in their endless war against the darkness that dwells in every human heart. In the shadow-haunted corridors of academia, where knowledge should illuminate and understanding should heal, there exists a figure whose pursuit of truth became so twisted that it transformed the very concept of learning into an instrument of terror. Jonathan Crane's story begins, not in the criminal underworld, but in the hallowed halls of Gotham University, where his brilliant mind first encountered the dark fascination that would consume his entire existence and transform him from educator into the embodiment of humanity's most primal emotion, fear itself. The young man who would become the Scarecrow possessed the kind of analytical intelligence that academia desperately needed, combined with a natural understanding of human psychology that should have made him one of the great healers of his generation. His doctoral dissertation on the neurochemistry of fear responses was groundbreaking work that promised to revolutionize treatment for anxiety disorders, phobias, and post-traumatic stress conditions that affected millions of people worldwide. Yet beneath this promising exterior lay psychological wounds that would eventually corrupt his noble intentions into something monstrous. Crane's childhood had been a laboratory of terror, administered by a father who believed that fear was the most effective educational tool available to parents who were serious about preparing their children for the harsh realities of adult existence. The basement of the family home became a chamber of calculated psychological torture where young Jonathan was subjected to systematic exposure to his deepest phobias, ostensibly to help him overcome them, but actually to satisfy his father's own twisted need to dominate and control through the infliction of suffering. The academic success that Crane achieved, despite this traumatic foundation, was both genuine accomplishment and elaborate psychological defense mechanism, a way of transforming his intimate knowledge of fear into something that appeared constructive and socially valuable. His studies allowed him to examine his own trauma from what seemed like objective scientific distance, while also providing him with increasingly sophisticated understanding of how terror operated at the neurological and psychological levels. The position he eventually obtained as professor of psychology at Gotham University represented the fulfillment of conventional success metrics, while also providing him with access to resources and subjects that would enable the darker aspects of his research to flourish beyond the boundaries of ethical oversight. His classroom became a testing ground where he could observe fear responses in controlled conditions, while his academic credentials provided cover for experiments that more conventional researchers would never have attempted. The transformation from respected academic to criminal began gradually, with minor ethical violations that seemed justified by their contribution to scientific understanding and potential therapeutic applications. Crane rationalized his increasingly questionable methods by focusing on the beneficial knowledge that might emerge from research that pushed beyond traditional limitations, telling himself that temporary discomfort experienced by his subjects was acceptable if it led to breakthroughs that could alleviate suffering for countless others. The fear toxin that would become his signature weapon started as legitimate pharmaceutical research into the neurochemical basis of phobic responses and anxiety disorders. The compounds he developed were intended to help patients confront their fears in controlled therapeutic environments, providing them with chemical courage that would enable productive examination of psychological issues that had previously been too overwhelming to address directly. Yet as Crane's research progressed and his understanding of fear's mechanisms became more sophisticated, he began to recognize possibilities that extended far beyond therapeutic applications. The same chemicals that could help patients overcome their phobias could also be modified to create or intensify fears, to induce specific phobic responses, or to generate states of terror so profound that they would leave permanent psychological scars on anyone unfortunate enough to experience them. The university's decision to terminate Crane's research program due to ethical concerns and complaints from students who had been traumatized by his increasingly aggressive experimental methods was experienced not as justified professional consequences, but as persecution by small-minded individuals who lacked the vision to appreciate the importance of his work. The dismissal letter that ended his academic career was filed away as evidence that society was not ready for the truths that his research had begun to reveal. The abandoned warehouse that Crane converted into his private laboratory after losing access to university facilities became a place where scientific methodology was perverted into systematic torture, where the pursuit of knowledge became indistinguishable from the infliction of suffering. The equipment he installed was state-of-the-art pharmaceutical manufacturing technology, capable of producing refined chemical compounds in quantities sufficient for large-scale distribution and testing. The scarecrow costume that gave him his criminal identity was more than simple disguise or theatrical flourish, representing instead a psychological externalization of his own deepest fears and childhood traumas. The burlap mask and tattered clothing transformed him into a living embodiment of the agricultural scarecrows that had terrified him as a child, allowing him to project his own phobias onto his victims, while simultaneously conquering them through the act of becoming the thing he had once feared most. The early crimes that established Scarecrow's reputation in Gotham's criminal underworld were relatively simple applications of his fear toxin technology, robberies and extortion schemes, where the chemical compounds served as tools for disabling security personnel and frightening witnesses into compliance. These initial successes demonstrated the practical applications of his research, while also providing him with the resources necessary to expand his operations and refine his chemical formulations. The psychological satisfaction that Crane derived from these criminal activities went far beyond the material benefits or professional vindication they provided, touching something deeper and more disturbing in his damaged psyche. The terror he saw in his victims' eyes was not simply evidence of his chemical compound's effectiveness, but also a form of validation that transformed his own childhood trauma into a source of power rather than weakness. The evolution of Scarecrow's methods from simple criminal applications to systematic psychological warfare began when he recognized that fear could be used not just as a tool for immediate tactical advantage, but as a weapon for long-term psychological destruction. The toxins he developed became increasingly sophisticated, designed not merely to induce temporary terror, but to create lasting phobias that would continue to torment his victims long after the initial exposure had ended. The research facility that Crane established in the depths of Gotham's underground tunnel system was a grotesque parody of legitimate pharmaceutical development, where human subjects were treated as laboratory animals and where scientific protocols were perverted to maximize suffering rather than minimize harm. The patients he acquired for his experiments were carefully selected from vulnerable populations who would not be missed by authorities or whose disappearances could be attributed to the normal casualty rate of urban life. The street people, drug addicts, and mentally ill individuals who became his primary test subjects were chosen not randomly, but according to specific criteria that made them ideal for different aspects of his research program. Their existing psychological vulnerabilities provided baseline conditions that allowed him to measure the effectiveness of his compounds, while their social isolation ensured that their suffering would go unnoticed by anyone capable of intervening on their behalf. The systematic nature of Crane's human experimentation revealed itself through the meticulous records he maintained, documenting not only the chemical compositions and dosages of his various toxins, but also detailed psychological profiles of his subjects and careful observations of their responses to different combinations of fear-inducing stimuli. His laboratory notebooks read like the journals of a dedicated scientist, except that the data they contained represented a catalogue of deliberately inflicted human misery. The breakthrough that enabled Scarecrow's most ambitious and horrific crime came through his development of airborne fear toxins that could be dispersed through building ventilation systems or released into open environments where they would affect large numbers of people simultaneously. These compounds represented years of chemical engineering work, requiring precise molecular modifications that would ensure proper dispersal while maintaining chemical stability and psychological effectiveness. The target he selected for his greatest experiment in mass psychological warfare was the most vulnerable population in Gotham City, the patients at Arkham Asylum, who were already struggling with severe mental illness and who lacked the psychological resources necessary to resist or recover from additional trauma. The twisted logic that justified this choice was that these individuals were already experiencing various forms of psychological distress, making them ideal subjects for research into how fear toxins interacted with pre-existing mental health conditions. The infiltration of Arkham's staff was accomplished through a combination of forged credentials, carefully cultivated professional relationships, and the exploitation of institutional weaknesses that made the facility vulnerable to exactly the kind of systematic infiltration that Crane had planned. His position as a consulting psychiatrist provided him with access to patient files, treatment areas, and most importantly, the ventilation systems that served the entire complex. The months of preparation that preceded the mass poisoning involved careful study of Arkham's daily routines, shift schedules, and security protocols, allowing Crane to identify the optimal timing and methods for introducing his fear toxins into the facility's air circulation system. The The chemical compounds he selected for this application were specifically designed to interact with the psychoactive medications that most patients were already receiving, creating synergistic effects that would amplify both the intensity and duration of the induced terror. The night that Scarecrow activated his plan was chosen to coincide with a shift change that would minimize the number of staff members present while maximizing the concentration of patients in their dormitory areas. The timing was calculated to ensure that the fear toxins would reach peak effectiveness during the early morning hours, when natural circadian rhythms made people most psychologically vulnerable, and when reduced staffing would delay any organized response to the crisis. The first signs that something was wrong appeared as isolated incidents that could have been attributed to normal psychiatric emergencies. Patients crying out in terror, violent episodes that required restraint, and reports of hallucinations that seemed more vivid and disturbing than usual. The staff members who responded to these initial calls were themselves beginning to experience the early effects of toxin exposure, though they initially attributed their growing anxiety and paranoia to the stress of dealing with multiple patient crises. The cascade of psychological collapse that followed as the toxins reached full concentration in the facility's atmosphere was unlike anything in the recorded history of psychiatric treatment, transforming Arkham from a place of healing into a chamber of collective nightmare, where both patients and staff became trapped in personalized hells crafted by Crane's chemical genius. The screams that echoed through the corridors were not the ordinary sounds of mental distress, but expressions of terror so profound that they seemed to come from some deeper level of human experience than normal consciousness could access. The specific effects of the fear toxins varied according to each individual's personal psychology and existing mental health conditions, creating a symphony of suffering that was both universally terrifying and uniquely personal to each victim. Patients who suffered from depression found their despair transformed into overwhelming terror of their own mortality, while those with anxiety disorders experienced their worries magnified into cosmic dread that encompassed every possible future catastrophe. The staff members who were caught in the facility during the attack faced their own personalized nightmares, with the toxins targeting the specific fears and insecurities that their professional training had taught them to suppress or manage. Doctors found themselves paralyzed by terror of making mistakes that would harm their patients, while nurses experienced overwhelming fear of contamination and disease that made it impossible for them to provide the medical care that the emergency demanded. The patients who had been suffering from schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders experienced perhaps the most devastating effects, as the fear toxins interacted with their existing delusions and hallucinations to create psychological realities so convincing and terrifying that they would never be able to distinguish between chemically induced experiences and actual memories. The boundaries between internal psychological states and external reality dissolved completely, leaving them trapped in worlds where their worst fears had become indistinguishable from objective truth. The children and adolescent patients who were housed in Arkham's juvenile wing suffered trauma that was particularly heartbreaking because their developing minds lacked the psychological resources necessary to contextualize or cope with the terror they experienced. The fear toxins affected their neurological development in ways that would influence their entire future relationship with fear, trust, and safety, potentially condemning them to lives defined by anxiety and psychological instability. The emergency response teams that eventually arrived at Arkham to address the crisis found themselves entering a facility that had been transformed into something resembling a vision of hell, where every room contained scenes of psychological breakdown so severe that even trained professionals found their own mental health threatened by simple observation of the suffering they encountered. The protective equipment they wore provided no defense against the emotional impact of witnessing human beings reduced to states of pure terror. The investigation that followed the Arkham attack revealed the full scope of Scarecrow's preparations and the scientific sophistication behind what appeared to be simply a criminal assault. The chemical analysis of the toxins recovered from the facility's ventilation system showed molecular structures so complex that they required advanced pharmaceutical knowledge to synthesize, while the targeting of specific neurotransmitter systems demonstrated understanding of brain chemistry that few legitimate researchers possessed. The victims who survived the Night of Terror faced a long and uncertain recovery process that was complicated by the unknown long-term effects of exposure to experimental psychoactive compounds. Many never regained their previous level of psychological functioning, remaining trapped in states of chronic anxiety and hypervigilance that made normal social interaction impossible. Others developed specific phobias so severe that they were unable to function in environments that contained even minor reminders of their traumatic experience. The staff members who had been poisoned along with the patients faced their own challenges in returning to normal life and work, with many finding it impossible to continue careers in psychiatric treatment because their own exposure to the fear toxins had left them unable to maintain the emotional stability and professional detachment that effective therapy required. The facility itself had to be extensively decontaminated and rebuilt, with new security protocols designed to prevent similar attacks in the future. The psychological impact of the Arkham attack extended far beyond its immediate victims to affect the entire psychiatric treatment community, raising questions about the safety of mental health facilities and the vulnerability of patients who were already struggling with severe psychological conditions. The knowledge that someone with advanced scientific training could weaponize their expertise against the most vulnerable members of society challenged fundamental assumptions about professional ethics and social responsibility. The legal proceedings that followed Scarecrow's capture were complicated by the same issues of criminal insanity that had plagued previous cases involving Gotham's costumed criminals, with defense attorneys arguing that Crane's own psychological disorders made him incapable of understanding the wrongfulness of his actions. The irony that a man who had spent his career studying mental illness would claim mental illness as a defense was not lost on observers, who noted the circular logic involved in such arguments. The scientific community's response to Crane's crimes involved extensive review of research protocols and ethical oversight procedures, with particular attention to studies involving human subjects and potentially dangerous chemical compounds. The regulations that emerged from these reviews made it more difficult for researchers to conduct the kind of experimental work that had led to the development of fear toxins, though critics argued that determined criminals would simply move their operations outside legitimate institutional frameworks. The philosophical questions raised by Scarecrow's use of fear as a weapon touched on fundamental issues about the nature of consciousness and the relationship between chemical processes and psychological experience. His ability to manipulate human emotions through molecular interventions challenged assumptions about free will and personal responsibility, while raising disturbing possibilities about the potential for chemical control of human behavior in political and social contexts. The broader implications of the Arkham attack for understanding terrorism and psychological warfare were not lost on law enforcement and military analysts, who recognized that Crane had demonstrated techniques that could be scaled up and applied to much larger populations. The possibility that hostile groups might develop similar chemical weapons created new categories of security concerns that required entirely new forms of defensive preparation and response capability. In the context of Gotham's ongoing struggle with criminal insanity and costumed villainy, the Scarecrow's assault on Arkham represented a unique form of evil that combined scientific sophistication with psychological sadism in ways that challenged both legal and therapeutic responses. His crimes could not be understood simply as expressions of mental illness or criminal greed, but rather as deliberate attempts to inflict maximum psychological suffering on people who were already experiencing the worst that mental illness had to offer. The lasting legacy of Jonathan Crane's transformation from healer to horror serves as a cautionary tale about the potential for knowledge to be corrupted when it is divorced from compassion and ethical restraint. His story demonstrates how intellectual achievement without moral development can become more dangerous than simple ignorance, creating individuals who possess the capability to inflict sophisticated forms of harm that less educated criminals could never imagine or execute. The continuing presence of fear toxins in Gotham's criminal ecosystem, as other villains have attempted to replicate or steal Scarecrow's chemical formulations, serves as a permanent reminder that some forms of knowledge, once released into the world, can never be completely contained or controlled. The techniques that Crane developed in his pursuit of understanding human fear have become part of the city's criminal heritage, available to anyone with sufficient resources and willingness to cross the moral boundaries that separate healing from harming, knowledge from cruelty, science from torture. In the shadow-soaked underworld of Gotham City, where fortunes are built upon the suffering of others and respectability serves as a mask for the most heinous crimes, there exists no figure more emblematic of evil disguised as legitimacy than Oswald Chesterfield Cobblepot. The man who would become known throughout the criminal world as the Penguin began his existence not in the gutters where most of Gotham's villains find their origins, but in the drawing rooms and private clubs where old money meets new corruption, where civilized conversation conceals savage appetites, and where the most monstrous crimes are committed by those who never soil their own hands with blood. The Cobblepot family name had once carried weight in Gotham's social hierarchy, representing generations of successful merchants and civic leaders who had helped build the city during its early industrial expansion. Yet by the time Oswald was born, that legacy had become more burden than blessing, a constant reminder of heights from which the family had fallen and standards they could no longer maintain through legitimate means alone. The physical deformities that marked Oswald from birth became both the source of his deepest psychological wounds and the foundation upon which he would build his criminal empire. His grotesquely shortened stature, his prominent nose that gave him a beak-like profile, and his waddling gait that earned him his avian nickname were not merely aesthetic inconveniences, but social stigmas that excluded him from the world of privilege and acceptance that his family name should have guaranteed. The cruelty of children and the barely concealed disgust of adults who were forced to interact with him during his formative years created psychological scars that would fester and spread throughout his developing personality, transforming natural intelligence and business acumen into weapons of revenge against a society that had judged him unworthy of basic human dignity. Every sneer, every whispered comment, every invitation withheld became fuel for ambitions that would eventually consume thousands of innocent lives. The transformation from social outcast to criminal mastermind began during Oswald's adolescence, when he discovered that his physical appearance, while making him an object of ridicule in conventional social contexts, could be transformed into an advantage in the criminal underworld where intimidation and unpredictability were valued more highly than traditional markers of respectability and success. The early crimes that established his reputation among Gotham's criminal fraternity were marked by a sophistication and strategic thinking that set him apart from the typical street-level thugs who dominated the city's illegal activities. Where others relied on brute force or simple intimidation, Cobblepot employed psychological warfare and careful manipulation of human weaknesses to achieve objectives that seemed impossible through conventional criminal methods. The umbrella that became his signature weapon and symbol was chosen not for its inherent lethality, but for its representation of respectability and genteel civilization, qualities that he would corrupt and weaponize in his war against the society that had rejected him. The modifications he made to these seemingly harmless accessories transformed them into sophisticated killing devices capable of delivering poisons, explosives, or projectile weapons while maintaining their innocent appearance. The legitimate businesses that Cobblepot established as fronts for his criminal operations were selected specifically for their respectability and their potential for providing cover for illegal activities that required sophisticated logistical support and public credibility. The restaurants, nightclubs, and import companies that bore his name became nodes in a network of corruption that extended throughout Gotham's political and economic establishment. The Iceberg Lounge, the crown jewel of his business empire, was designed to serve multiple functions simultaneously. A gathering place for Gotham's elite where valuable intelligence could be gathered through careful observation and discreet recording devices. A money laundering operation that could process enormous sums of illegal revenue through legitimate entertainment transactions. And most importantly, a theater where Cobblepot could display his power and sophistication to those who had once dismissed him as a figure of ridicule. The basement levels of the Iceberg Lounge, hidden beneath the elegant dining rooms and exclusive gaming areas, housed operations so vile that even hardened criminals who worked for Cobblepot preferred not to know the details of what transpired in those soundproof chambers. The legitimate patrons who enjoyed the club's hospitality remained blissfully unaware that their evening's entertainment was subsidized by crimes that would have made them physically ill if they had possessed knowledge of their true nature. The human trafficking network that represented the darkest aspect of Cobblepot's criminal empire began as a seemingly minor sideline, a service provided to wealthy clients who possessed appetites that could not be satisfied through legal means and who were willing to pay premium prices for discretion and exotic offerings. The initial operations were small in scale, involving only a few victims who were acquired through conventional kidnapping or manipulation of vulnerable individuals desperate for money or shelter. The systematic expansion of these activities into full-scale industrial exploitation of human beings was driven not merely by profit motives but by Cobblepot's deep-seated need to inflict suffering upon those who reminded him of his own vulnerabilities and social disadvantages. The victims he selected were chosen specifically for qualities that he found personally offensive: youth, beauty, innocence, hope, and the kind of natural dignity that his own appearance had always denied him. The recruitment methods employed by his organization combined sophisticated psychological manipulation with brutal coercion, targeting runaways, orphans, foreign immigrants, and others whose disappearances would not immediately attract official attention or public concern. The scouts who identified potential victims were trained to recognize vulnerability and isolation, to exploit trust and desperation, and to deliver their prey to processing facilities where human identity would be systematically destroyed and replaced with commercial value. The facilities where these human beings were processed and prepared for sale were designed with the same attention to efficiency and security that characterized his legitimate business operations, incorporating advanced surveillance technology, soundproofing, and climate control systems that could maintain precise environmental conditions for extended periods. The medical equipment installed in these locations served dual purposes, providing both the healthcare necessary to maintain the physical condition of valuable merchandise and the modification capabilities required to alter appearance and behavior according to customer specifications. The psychological conditioning techniques employed to break down the personalities and resistance of trafficking victims were developed through extensive research into military interrogation methods, psychiatric treatment protocols, and behavioral modification theories. The staff members who administered these programs were selected not merely for their technical competence, but for their ability to maintain emotional detachment from the suffering they inflicted, viewing their work as professional services rather than human rights violations. The client base that Cobblepot developed for his trafficking operations represented a cross-section of Gotham's most powerful and influential citizens, individuals whose public reputations and professional responsibilities would be destroyed by exposure of their private appetites and criminal activities. The blackmail potential inherent in these relationships provided Cobblepot with protection from law enforcement and political interference that no amount of conventional bribery could have secured. The children who formed the most valuable and vulnerable component of his trafficking inventory were acquired through methods that combined legitimate adoption services with outright kidnapping, creating a supply chain that could provide clients with victims who possessed specific physical characteristics, educational backgrounds, and psychological profiles. The paperwork that accompanied these transactions was sophisticated enough to withstand casual inspection, while being deliberately flawed in ways that would ensure legal complications if any client attempted to expose the operation. The training programs that prepared these young victims for their intended roles were designed to destroy their capacity for independent thought and emotional resistance, while preserving the physical and mental capabilities that clients valued. The techniques employed included controlled malnutrition that would maintain desirable physical proportions while weakening resistance, sensory deprivation that would increase psychological dependence upon handlers, and systematic abuse that would normalize violence and submission as natural aspects of human relationships. The auction system through which these human beings were sold combined elements of traditional slavery markets with modern commercial practices, utilizing secure communication networks and encrypted financial transactions that provided anonymity for buyers while ensuring payment security for the seller. The catalogs that advertised available inventory contained detailed physical descriptions and behavioral assessments that reduced complex human beings to collections of marketable attributes and capabilities. The transportation network that delivered victims to their final destinations was integrated with Cobblepot's legitimate shipping and logistics operations, utilizing commercial vehicles and established trade routes that were unlikely to attract official scrutiny. The documentation that accompanied these shipments identified human cargo as legitimate commercial goods, while the containers in which victims were transported included life support systems and monitoring equipment that ensured valuable merchandise would arrive in acceptable condition. The enforcement arm of Cobblepot's organization was responsible for maintaining discipline within the trafficking operations, while also eliminating threats from competitors, law enforcement, and victims who attempted to escape or expose the crimes being committed against them. The personnel selected for these roles were chosen specifically for their psychological capacity to inflict violence upon vulnerable populations without experiencing emotional distress or moral qualms about their actions. The disposal methods employed to eliminate evidence of the organization's activities included both conventional murder techniques and more sophisticated approaches that would ensure bodies were never discovered or identified. The chemical processing facilities that served this function were integrated with legitimate waste disposal operations, while the personnel who operated them possessed technical expertise in forensic countermeasures and evidence destruction. The corruption network that protected Cobblepot's operations from official interference extended throughout Gotham's law enforcement, judicial, and political establishments, incorporating everyone from patrol officers who ignored suspicious activities to judges who ensured that any prosecutions would fail on technical grounds. The payments that maintained these corrupt relationships were structured as legitimate business expenses, while the blackmail materials that ensured continued cooperation were stored in secure locations with dead man switches that would automatically release compromising information if Cobblepot were arrested or killed. The money laundering operations that processed revenue from human trafficking were integrated with legitimate financial institutions and international banking networks, utilizing sophisticated accounting methods and regulatory arbitrage to transform illegal profits into apparently legitimate business income. The complexity of these transactions was deliberately designed to exceed the analytical capabilities of most law enforcement agencies, while the international components ensured that any investigation would require cooperation between multiple jurisdictions with incompatible legal systems. The investigation that eventually exposed the full scope of Cobblepot's trafficking operations began with the accidental discovery of financial irregularities in his legitimate businesses, leading to broader inquiries that gradually revealed connections between seemingly unrelated criminal activities. The breakthrough came when a survivor of the trafficking network provided testimony that corroborated physical evidence and financial records that had previously seemed meaningless when examined in isolation. The rescue operations that freed hundreds of victims from Cobblepot's facilities revealed the full horror of what had been perpetrated in the service of profit and personal revenge, with investigators finding evidence of systematic torture, medical experimentation, and psychological conditioning that had left permanent damage on everyone who had survived the experience. The youngest victims required years of intensive therapy to recover even basic social functioning, while many of the adults never regained their capacity for normal emotional relationships or professional productivity. The trial that followed Cobblepot's arrest was complicated by the international nature of his operations and the involvement of powerful individuals whose cooperation was essential for prosecution, but whose own criminal liability made them unreliable witnesses. The evidence that was admissible in court represented only a fraction of the crimes that investigators believed had been committed, while many of the most serious charges could not be proven to the standards required for criminal conviction. The sentences that were ultimately imposed reflected the limitations of legal systems that had not been designed to address crimes of such scope and sophistication, with Cobblepot receiving punishment that seemed inadequate when measured against the suffering he had caused but represented the maximum penalty that could be justified under existing law. The civil suits that followed the criminal proceedings provided some compensation to victims but could not restore what had been taken from them during their captivity. The ongoing impact of Cobblepot's crimes extended far beyond the immediate victims to affect their families, the communities from which they had been taken, and the social services systems that struggled to provide appropriate care for survivors of trauma so severe that existing treatment protocols were inadequate to address their needs. The psychological research that emerged from studying these cases contributed to better understanding of human trafficking effects, but came at the cost of additional trauma for survivors who participated in these studies. The legislative changes that were enacted in response to the exposure of Cobblepot's operations strengthened penalties for human trafficking, while providing law enforcement with additional tools for investigating and prosecuting these crimes. The international cooperation agreements that were negotiated to address the cross-border nature of trafficking networks created new frameworks for sharing intelligence and coordinating enforcement actions, though critics argued that these measures addressed symptoms rather than underlying causes. The social impact of learning that one of Gotham's most respected businessmen had been operating industrial-scale human trafficking operations while maintaining a public facade of civic responsibility and charitable giving created lasting trauma for a community that had trusted appearances and social status as indicators of moral character. The revelation that evil could hide behind respectability challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between wealth, education, and ethical behavior. The victims who survived Cobblepot's trafficking network faced lifelong challenges in rebuilding their identities and relationships, with many requiring ongoing medical treatment for physical injuries and psychiatric care for psychological trauma that manifested in complex patterns of anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress. The support networks that developed to assist these survivors became models for helping other trafficking victims, though the resources available were never adequate to address the full scope of need. The criminal organization that Cobblepot had built continued to operate even after his imprisonment, with lieutenants and business partners maintaining aspects of the trafficking network, while law enforcement struggled to identify and arrest all participants in operations that had involved hundreds of criminals across multiple countries. The legacy of corruption that had protected these activities created ongoing obstacles to complete dismantlement of the network, while the demand from wealthy clients ensured that new suppliers would eventually emerge to fill the market niche that Cobblepot's arrest had created. In the broader context of Gotham's struggle against organized crime and costumed villainy, the Penguin's human trafficking operations represented a form of evil that was both more mundane and more horrific than the theatrical crimes committed by other members of the city's rogues gallery. His crimes were not motivated by insanity or cosmic philosophy, but by simple greed and resentment, making them more comprehensible, yet somehow more disturbing than acts committed by criminals who could claim mental illness or ideological motivation as partial explanations for their behavior. The continuing presence of Cobblepot's name on legitimate businesses and charitable organizations throughout Gotham served as a permanent reminder that evil could achieve respectability through careful public relations and strategic philanthropy. While the most horrific crimes were often committed by individuals who appeared to be pillars of their communities rather than obvious threats to public safety and moral order. In the shadowed recesses of intellectual vanity, where brilliance becomes its own corruption and the need for recognition transforms into hunger for dominance over others, there dwells a mind so consumed by its own superiority that it has perverted the very concept of knowledge into an instrument of death. Edward Nygma's story begins not in madness or trauma, but in the far more commonplace tragedy of exceptional intelligence paired with profound emotional immaturity, creating a combination that would prove more dangerous than any chemical weapon or cosmic force that Gotham had ever encountered. The young man who would become the Riddler possessed the kind of analytical mind that should have revolutionized scientific understanding and contributed to humanity's greatest achievements. Yet his gifts were corrupted from their earliest manifestation by a pathological need for acknowledgement and validation that no amount of genuine accomplishment could ever satisfy. His childhood was marked not by abuse or neglect, but by the subtler poison of constant praise that taught him to value being right more than being good, to prioritize intellectual triumph over human connection. The academic achievements that marked Nygma's early career were genuine and impressive, earning him recognition from prestigious institutions and providing him with opportunities to contribute to fields as diverse as computer science, cryptography, and behavioral psychology. Yet each success only intensified his hunger for more dramatic demonstrations of his superiority, more public acknowledgements of his intellectual gifts, more evidence that he was fundamentally different from and better than the ordinary minds that surrounded him in every professional and social context. The transformation from legitimate researcher to criminal mastermind began with Nygma's growing frustration at what he perceived as society's inability to properly appreciate the scope and significance of his intellectual achievements. The recognition he received from academic peers and professional organizations, while substantial by any objective measure, felt inadequate when measured against his internal sense of his own importance and uniqueness. He began to believe that conventional success metrics were insufficient to demonstrate true intellectual superiority. The obsession with riddles and puzzles that would define his criminal career started as a legitimate interest in cognitive psychology and problem-solving methodologies, but gradually evolved into something more sinister as Nigma began to view other people not as fellow human beings deserving of respect and consideration, but as test subjects whose primary value lay in their potential to serve as audiences for demonstrations of his mental superiority. Every interaction became an opportunity to prove his intellectual dominance. The early crimes that established his reputation in Gotham's underworld were relatively benign intellectual exercises, elaborate puzzles and challenges that were designed more to showcase his cleverness than to cause serious harm to their targets. These initial schemes attracted attention from law enforcement and media outlets, providing Nigma with the recognition he craved, while also demonstrating that criminal activity could be a more effective platform for displaying his abilities than legitimate academic achievement. The escalation from harmless puzzles to deadly games began when Nigma realized that the stakes involved in his challenges directly correlated with the amount of attention they received from both authorities and the general public. Simple riddles were dismissed as pranks or minor criminal mischief, while puzzles that involved genuine danger to human life commanded the kind of serious response that satisfied his need to be taken seriously as a formidable intellectual opponent. The methodology that Nigma developed for his death traps combined advanced engineering knowledge with sophisticated understanding of human psychology, creating scenarios where victims faced not simply physical danger but mental anguish as they struggled to solve problems under extreme time pressure while knowing that failure meant death. The intellectual component of these challenges was not incidental to their lethality but rather their primary purpose, transforming murder into a form of academic examination where wrong answers carried ultimate consequences. The selection process for his victims revealed the depths of Nigma's narcissistic pathology, as he consistently chose targets not based on any personal grievance or criminal association, but rather according to their potential to serve as appropriate test subjects for his increasingly complex puzzles. Intelligence, education, and professional success were qualities that made potential victims more rather than less likely to be selected, as Nigma derived particular satisfaction from defeating minds that others considered exceptional. The elaborate death traps that became his signature crimes were marvels of mechanical engineering and psychological manipulation, incorporating elements borrowed from escape room design, military ordnance, industrial safety systems, and behavioral conditioning techniques. Each device was custom designed for its intended victim, taking into account their specific knowledge base, physical capabilities, and psychological profile to create challenges that were theoretically solvable but practically impossible under the stress conditions imposed by imminent death. The first mass casualty event that established Nigma as one of Gotham's most dangerous criminals occurred when he gained access to a downtown office building and converted its conference rooms into a deadly quiz show where dozens of business executives and their families were forced to participate in intellectual competitions where incorrect answers triggered lethal consequences for randomly selected participants. The psychological torture of watching innocent people die because of others' intellectual failures was as important to Nigma as demonstrating his own superior knowledge. The families who found themselves trapped in Nigma's deadly game show represented a cross-section of Gotham's professional middle class: accountants, lawyers, doctors, and managers who had committed no crime beyond the accident of working in a building that Nigma had selected for his experiment. Their children, spouses, and elderly relatives became collateral damage in an intellectual exercise that treated human life as stakes in a cosmic gambling game where the house always won. The quiz format that Nigma employed for this mass murder event was designed to exploit the competitive instincts and professional pride that characterized his victims' normal work environment, transforming qualities that had contributed to their success into weapons that could be used against them and their loved ones. Questions were carefully crafted to seem answerable by people with appropriate education and experience, yet contained subtle tricks and ambiguities that made correct responses nearly impossible under the psychological pressure of life or death stakes. The technological systems that controlled the death traps were integrated with advanced computer networks that could process responses instantaneously, while also recording every moment of the victim's psychological breakdown for Don 4, Nigma's later review and analysis. The cameras installed throughout the building captured not only the physical effects of the lethal devices, but also the emotional reactions of survivors who were forced to watch their colleagues and family members die because of intellectual failures that seemed so minor in retrospect. The time limits imposed for each question were calculated to maximize psychological stress while maintaining the appearance of fairness, providing just enough time for participants to understand the question and begin formulating responses, but insufficient time for careful consideration or collaborative problem-solving that might have improved their chances of survival. The countdown timers that displayed remaining time served both practical and psychological functions, creating visual manifestations of approaching doom that intensified the mental pressure on participants. The random selection process that determined which victims would die for incorrect answers was perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of Nigma's game show format, as it ensured that participants could not protect themselves or their loved ones through superior performance, but could only watch helplessly as their failures contributed to a lottery system that distributed death according to chance rather than merit or justice. The arbitrary nature of these selections was designed to break down the participants' sense of agency and control. The questions themselves covered topics ranging from classical literature and advanced mathematics to obscure historical facts and contemporary pop culture, creating an intellectual landscape where no single person could reasonably be expected to possess sufficient knowledge to answer every query correctly. The breadth of subject matter ensured that even the most educated participants would eventually encounter areas where their knowledge was insufficient, making fatal errors mathematically inevitable. The escape attempts that some participants made during the early stages of the game show were anticipated and countered by security systems that had been designed with input from military personnel and prison designers, creating physical barriers that were insurmountable without tools or knowledge that none of the victims possessed. The failure of these escape attempts served to reinforce Nigma's message that intellectual superiority was the only path to survival in his carefully constructed environment. The intervention attempts by Gotham City Police Department were frustrated by the complexity of Nigma's security systems and his advanced preparation for law enforcement response, including electronic countermeasures that blocked radio communications and structural modifications that made conventional rescue operations impossible without triggering additional lethal devices. The building itself had been transformed into a fortress designed to keep authorities out while keeping victims trapped within reach of the death traps. The psychological breakdown of participants as the game show progressed provided Nigma with the validation he had been seeking throughout his criminal career, demonstrating conclusively that his intellectual abilities were superior to those of people who had achieved conventional success through normal professional channels. The terror and desperation he observed in his victims' faces confirmed his belief that ordinary minds were fundamentally inferior and deserved whatever fate his superior intellect deemed appropriate. The children who were forced to witness their parents' deaths during the quiz show suffered psychological trauma that would affect their emotional development for the remainder of their lives, creating patterns of anxiety and mistrust that made normal social relationships difficult or impossible. The survivors who managed to live through the experience carried guilt about their survival that was compounded by knowledge that their correct answers had contributed to the deaths of others through the random selection system. The parents who watched their children die because of intellectual failures that seemed trivial in any other context experienced a form of guilt and self-blame that traditional grief counseling was inadequate to address, as they struggled with the knowledge that better education or quicker thinking might have saved the people they loved most. The arbitrary nature of the selection system provided no comfort, as it meant that competence and preparation offered no protection against random tragedy. The first responders who eventually gained access to the building after Nigma's escape found scenes of carnage that were unlike anything in their previous experience with criminal violence, as the victims had died not from conventional weapons, but from elaborate mechanical devices that had been triggered by intellectual failures rather than physical aggression. The psychological impact on rescue personnel was severe, as they struggled to understand how knowledge-based competitions could produce such devastating human casualties. The forensic investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Nigma's preparation and the sophisticated understanding of human psychology that had guided his design of the deadly game show format. The evidence collected from the building's computer systems showed months of planning and research into his intended victims' backgrounds, educational histories, and psychological profiles, demonstrating that their selection had been far from random, despite Nigma's claims that he was simply testing general human intelligence. The legal proceedings that followed Nigma's eventual capture were complicated by the unprecedented nature of his crimes and the difficulty of establishing appropriate charges for murders that had been committed through intellectual, competition rather than direct violence. The prosecution faced challenges in explaining to juries how quiz show questions could constitute murder weapons, while defense attorneys argued that their client's mental illness made him incapable of understanding the consequences of his actions. The media coverage of the quiz show murders created lasting cultural impact that extended far beyond Gotham's borders, as news organizations struggled to explain how intellectual pursuits that were normally considered beneficial and entertaining had been transformed into instruments of mass murder. The coverage raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of competition, the value placed on intelligence in contemporary society, and the potential for educational systems to create individuals whose intellectual pride overwhelmed their human empathy. The survivors of Nigma's quiz show, who required ongoing psychological treatment, found that traditional trauma therapy was insufficient to address the specific nature of their experience, as existing protocols had been designed to help victims of conventional violence rather than people who had been tortured through intellectual challenges and forced to watch others die because of mental failures. New therapeutic approaches had to be developed specifically to address the unique psychological damage caused by these crimes. The families of victims who had died during the quiz show faced legal and financial challenges in seeking compensation for their losses, as existing insurance policies and victim compensation programs had not anticipated deaths that resulted from participation in intellectual competitions. The precedent-setting lawsuits that followed established new categories of liability and compensation for crimes that combined entertainment formats with lethal violence. The educational institutions where Nigma had achieved his early success were forced to examine their role in creating individuals whose intellectual development had proceeded without corresponding moral growth, leading to reforms in academic programs and student counseling services designed to identify and address narcissistic tendencies before they could develop into antisocial behavior patterns. The reviews revealed systemic failures in recognizing warning signs of intellectual arrogance and emotional immaturity. The technology companies that had provided equipment and services used in Nigma's death traps faced scrutiny regarding their responsibility for preventing criminal applications of their products. leading to new industry standards for monitoring unusual purchases and reporting suspicious activities to law enforcement agencies. The complexity of Nigma's devices had required components from multiple manufacturers, none of whom had recognized the criminal potential of their individual contributions. The competitive academic culture that had shaped Nigma's early development came under criticism from educators and psychologists, who argued that excessive emphasis on individual achievement and intellectual superiority created environments where students learned to value being right more than being compassionate. Reform movements emerged that sought to balance academic rigor with social and emotional learning, designed to prevent the kind of moral disconnection that had characterized Nigma's development. The prison psychologists who evaluated Nigma after his conviction found that his narcissistic personality disorder was so severe that he was incapable of experiencing genuine remorse for his victims' deaths, viewing them instead as necessary casualties in his quest to demonstrate intellectual superiority. The treatment protocols developed for his case became models for addressing similar conditions in other inmates whose crimes had been motivated by pathological narcissism rather than conventional criminal motivations. The ongoing threat that Nigma continued to pose, even while incarcerated, was demonstrated by his ability to manipulate prison staff and fellow inmates through intellectual games and psychological manipulation, leading to additional security measures and specialized training for personnel assigned to work with intellectually gifted criminals whose disabilities made them particularly dangerous despite their apparent lack of physical threat. Capability. The broader implications of Nigma's crimes for understanding the relationship between intelligence and morality challenged fundamental assumptions about education and human development, suggesting that intellectual gifts without corresponding emotional maturity and ethical training could produce individuals who were more rather than less dangerous to society. The research that emerged from studying his case contributed to better understanding of narcissistic personality disorder, while also raising troubling questions about the potential for creating inadvertent monsters through educational systems that prioritized achievement over character development. In the context of Gotham's ongoing struggle with costumed criminals and organized crime, the Riddler's quiz show murders represented a unique form of evil that combined intellectual sophistication with complete moral emptiness, creating crimes that were both deeply personal and utterly meaningless. His victims died not because they had wronged him or because their deaths served any practical purpose, but simply because their intellectual failures provided him with opportunities to demonstrate his superiority over minds he considered fundamentally inferior to his own brilliant but twisted intellect. In the grand halls of justice, where truth should reign supreme and fairness should govern every decision, there once stood a man whose very presence seemed to embody the highest ideals of law and order, whose commitment to protecting the innocent and punishing the guilty had made him a beacon of hope in a city perpetually shrouded in corruption and despair. Harvey Dent's story is perhaps the most tragic in all of Gotham's dark chronicle, for it tells not of someone born to evil or driven to madness by external forces, but of goodness itself transformed into its opposite through a single moment of horrific violence that split both his face and his soul into irreconcilable halves. The young man who would become Gotham's youngest district attorney possessed the kind of moral clarity and unwavering dedication to justice that the city's legal system desperately needed to cleanse itself of the corruption that had infected every level of government and law enforcement. His early career was marked by a series of prosecutorial victories against organized crime figures who had previously considered themselves untouchable. Protected by networks of bribed officials and intimidated witnesses that had made successful prosecution virtually impossible. Harvey's methods were characterized by meticulous preparation and an absolute refusal to compromise with evil in any form, earning him both the admiration of honest citizens who had lost faith in their institutions and the hatred of criminal organizations who recognized him as an existential threat to their operations. His partnership with Commissioner Gordon and the mysterious vigilante known as Batman created a triumvirate of justice that seemed capable of finally breaking the stranglehold that corruption and violence had maintained over Gotham for generations. The psychological foundation that supported Harvey's crusade against crime was built upon an almost childlike faith in the fundamental difference between right and wrong, a belief system that allowed him to navigate complex moral landscapes by consistently choosing the path that served justice over the one that offered personal advantage or political expediency. This moral certainty was both his greatest strength as a prosecutor and the source of the psychological vulnerability that would ultimately destroy him. The enemies that Harvey made through his prosecutorial successes were not content to accept defeat through normal legal channels, recognizing that his incorruptible nature made traditional methods of neutralization through bribery or blackmail completely ineffective. The criminal organizations that had suffered from his investigations began to develop more direct and personal approaches to eliminating the threat he represented to their operations and their freedom. The attack that would forever change the trajectory of Harvey's life and Gotham's legal system occurred during what should have been a routine court proceeding, when a defendant facing multiple life sentences for organized crime activities chose to exact immediate revenge rather than accept the consequences of his conviction. The bottle of industrial acid that had been smuggled into the courtroom was thrown with precise timing to cause maximum disfigurement while ensuring that the victim would survive to experience the full psychological impact of his physical transformation. The chemical burning that destroyed half of Harvey's face was agonizing beyond description, dissolving skin and muscle tissue while creating permanent nerve damage that would cause constant pain for the remainder of his life. Yet the physical trauma was merely the surface manifestation of deeper psychological damage that would prove far more destructive than any bodily injury, as the acid attack shattered the fundamental assumptions about justice and fairness that had defined his entire worldview and professional identity. The months of medical treatment that followed the attack provided time for Harvey's damaged psyche to process the implications of what had happened to him, leading to the gradual realization that his faith in the reliability of legal systems and moral order had been naive at best and dangerously delusional at worst. The random nature of the violence he had experienced challenged every belief he had held about the relationship between virtue and reward, justice and protection, good behavior, and positive outcomes. The psychological evaluation that was conducted during his recovery revealed the emergence of dissociative symptoms that reflected his inability to reconcile his previous worldview with the reality of his current situation, leading to the development of alternate personality patterns that could accommodate moral perspectives his original self would have found unthinkable. The duality that had always existed in his prosecutorial work between mercy and justice began to manifest as literal split personality disorder. The coin that became the symbol of Harvey's psychological transformation was originally a gift from his father, a silver dollar that had served as a good luck charm throughout his legal career and had been in his pocket during every major trial and important decision. The acid attack had damaged one side of the coin just as it had damaged one side of his face, creating a perfect metaphor for the divided nature of his new psychological reality. The philosophy that governed Harvey's post-attack worldview rejected the concept of moral absolute in favor of pure chance as the ultimate arbiter of human fate, reflecting his belief that the universe operated according to random principles rather than the just order he had previously trusted to reward virtue. and punish evil. The coin flip became his method for making all decisions, removing personal responsibility and moral agency from choices that had once been guided by careful ethical consideration. The return to active legal practice that Harvey attempted after his physical recovery was marked by increasingly erratic behavior that reflected his internal struggle between his original commitment to justice and his new belief in the fundamental randomness of existence. Cases that he had once approached with methodical preparation and unwavering moral purpose now became exercises in arbitrary decision-making, guided solely by the results of coin tosses. The courthouse massacre that would establish Harvey Dent's reputation as one of Gotham's most dangerous criminals began as an attempt to demonstrate his new philosophy through direct application to the legal system that had failed to protect him from violence and disfigurement. His plan involved taking control of the criminal justice building during a busy session day when dozens of cases were being heard simultaneously, creating maximum opportunity for his twisted form of justice to be administered to as many people as possible. The weapons that Harvey brought to the courthouse were selected specifically for their symbolic value rather than their efficiency as instruments of violence, including vintage firearms that represented the Old West justice he had studied in law school and explosives that could deliver random death in ways that paralleled the arbitrary nature of the acid attack that had transformed him. Each device was designed to create situations where survival would depend upon chance rather than merit or virtue. The hostages that Harvey took during his siege of the courthouse represented every aspect of the legal system that he had once served with distinction. Judges who made life and death decisions based on legal precedent, prosecutors who sought convictions through evidence and argument, defense attorneys who protected the rights of the accused, and ordinary citizens whose lives were affected by the outcomes of judicial proceedings. His selection ensured that his demonstration would impact everyone involved in the administration of justice. The twisted trial format that Harvey established in the captured courthouse was designed to expose what he viewed as the fundamental arbitrariness of all legal proceedings, replacing carefully considered evidence and legal argument with simple coin flips that would determine guilt or innocence, conviction or acquittal, life or death. The elaborate judicial procedures that had once governed his professional life were reduced to binary choices determined by chance rather than reason. The victims who were forced to participate in Harvey's randomized justice system found themselves facing consequences that bore no relationship to their actions, their character, or their legal situation, as court clerks faced the same potential death sentences as accused murderers, and veteran judges received the same arbitrary treatment as first-time defendants. The psychological trauma of experiencing justice reduced to gambling created lasting mental health impacts that traditional legal remedies could not address. The defendants who had been scheduled for normal trial proceedings during Harvey's takeover of the courthouse were subjected to accelerated judicial processes where complex criminal cases were resolved through coin flips rather than jury deliberations, creating situations where obviously guilty criminals were released, while innocent people faced immediate execution based solely on the random results of chance rather than any consideration of evidence or legal principle. The court officials who were forced to participate in Harvey's perverted judicial proceedings experienced the complete destruction of their professional identity and ethical framework as they were compelled to implement legal decisions that violated every principle they had sworn to uphold. The judges who were forced to pronounce death sentences based on coin flips rather than legal reasoning suffered psychological trauma that ended their careers and destroyed their faith in the legal system they had devoted their lives to serving. The family members who had come to the courthouse as witnesses or supporters in routine legal proceedings found themselves drawn into Harvey's demonstration of arbitrary justice where their survival depended not on their innocence or their relationship to the legal proceedings, but solely on the random outcomes of coin tosses that treated human life as stakes in a cosmic gambling game where the house had no interest in the welfare of the players. The law enforcement officers who attempted to negotiate with Harvey during his courthouse siege discovered that traditional hostage negotiation techniques were ineffective against someone whose decision-making process was explicitly designed to eliminate rational consideration and emotional appeal, as his responses to their offers and threats were determined entirely by coin flips rather than any assessment of personal advantage or concern for consequences. The media coverage of Harvey's courthouse massacre created unprecedented ethical challenges for news organizations that were forced to decide how much detail to provide about proceedings that violated every standard of journalistic responsibility, while also serving important public interest functions by documenting the complete breakdown of legal institutions. The footage that was broadcast showed respected legal professionals reduced to participants in deadly games of chance. The SWAT team assault that eventually ended Harvey's occupation of the courthouse required tactical approaches that had never been tested against opponents whose behavior was genuinely unpredictable, as standard protocols for containing armed criminals assumed rational decision-making processes that could be influenced through strategic pressure and negotiated resolution. The randomness of Harvey's responses made traditional tactical planning virtually impossible. The casualty count from Harvey's courthouse massacre reflected the purely arbitrary nature of his selection process, with victims including everyone from seasoned criminal defense attorneys to court stenographers who had simply been performing their routine professional duties when they were caught in his demonstration of chaotic justice. The deaths served no purpose beyond illustrating Harvey's philosophical point about the randomness of existence and the meaninglessness of moral behavior. The survivors of the courthouse attack faced unique challenges in processing their trauma, as traditional victim counseling approaches were designed to help people find meaning in their suffering, rather than confront the possibility that their experience had been genuinely meaningless. The random nature of who lived and who died made it impossible for survivors to develop coherent narratives about their ordeal that could support psychological healing. The legal profession's response to Harvey's crimes involved extensive soul-searching about the potential for respected members of the legal community to become threats to the very system they had sworn to protect, leading to new screening procedures and ongoing psychological evaluation requirements for prosecutors and judges. The reforms reflected recognition that moral certainty could become psychological vulnerability when subjected to sufficient trauma. The courthouse building itself required extensive reconstruction to address both the physical damage from Harvey's occupation and the psychological impact on court personnel who were expected to return to work in a location where they had witnessed the complete breakdown of legal order. The new security systems that were installed reflected hard-learned lessons about the potential for threats to emerge from within the legal system rather than outside it. The criminal trial that followed Harvey's capture was complicated by his obvious mental illness and the unprecedented nature of his crimes, which combined elements of terrorism, mass murder, and systematic destruction of legal institutions in ways that existing criminal statutes had not anticipated. The prosecution faced challenges in seeking appropriate punishment for someone whose crimes had been motivated by psychological breakdown rather than conventional criminal intent. The psychiatric evaluation that was conducted to determine Harvey's competency for trial revealed the complete fragmentation of his original personality and the emergence of distinct psychological entities that operated according to incompatible moral frameworks. making traditional assessments of criminal responsibility virtually impossible. The experts who examined him disagreed about whether he retained sufficient connection to his original identity to be held accountable for his actions. The impact of Harvey's transformation on Gotham's legal system extended far beyond the immediate casualties of his courthouse massacre, to include the resignation of numerous judges and prosecutors who found themselves unable to continue working in a profession that had been so thoroughly corrupted by one of their most respected colleagues. The brain drain that resulted weakened the city's capacity to address crime and corruption for years to come. The symbolic significance of Harvey's fall from White Knight to villain became a source of ongoing psychological trauma for Gotham's residents, who had invested enormous hope in his crusade against corruption, and had viewed him as proof that good could triumph over evil through dedication and moral courage. His transformation into Two-Face served as evidence that even the best people could be destroyed by sufficient violence and trauma. The coin that Harvey continued to use for all decisions during his incarceration became the subject of extensive psychological study, as researchers attempted to understand how a simple binary choice mechanism could provide sufficient structure for a completely fragmented personality to function in social situations. The randomness that the coin represented had become the only consistent element in a psyche that had been shattered beyond any possibility of conventional repair. The attempts to treat Harvey's condition through conventional psychiatric intervention met with limited success, as his dissociative disorder was complicated by the philosophical component of his transformation and his intellectual commitment to randomness as a governing principle for human behavior. The medications that could address his brain chemistry were ineffective against his conscious choice to embrace chaos as a replacement for the moral order that had failed to protect him. The ongoing threat that Harvey posed, even while institutionalized, was demonstrated by his ability to influence other patients and staff members through his charismatic presentation of nihilistic philosophy, converting people to his worldview, that moral behavior was meaningless, and that chance was the only honest basis for making decisions about life and death. His impact on Arkham Asylum's therapeutic environment was consistently negative. The legacy of Harvey Dent's transformation from hero to villain served as a permanent reminder that goodness was fragile, and that even the most dedicated champions of justice could be broken by sufficient trauma and violence, creating lasting damage to public confidence in institutions and individuals who claim to serve the cause of justice and moral order in a fundamentally chaotic and dangerous world. In the broader context of Gotham's struggle against crime and corruption, Two-Face represented the most personal form of defeat that the forces of justice had ever experienced, as his fall demonstrated that evil could triumph not through superior power or better strategy, but through the simple expedient of breaking good people until they abandoned their principles and embraced the very chaos they had once fought against with such dedication and success. In the ancient mountains of the Hindu Kush, where civilizations have risen and fallen like morning mist across millennia, where the bones of empires lie buried beneath shifting sands, and the whispers of forgotten gods still echo in hidden valleys, there dwells an entity whose very existence challenges humanity's understanding of mortality, purpose, and the delicate balance between preservation and destruction that governs all life on Earth. Ra's al Ghul, whose name means the demon's head in the tongue of desert wanderers who first encountered his legend, represents not merely a criminal mastermind but a force of nature given human form, an immortal consciousness that has witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations while maintaining an unwavering commitment to a vision of planetary salvation that requires the elimination of most human life. The origins of the being who would become known as Ra's al Ghul are lost in the mists of antiquity, buried beneath centuries of legend and myth that have obscured the historical facts of his birth and early development. What can be determined from the fragmentary records that survive is that he was born during an era when the boundaries between science and sorcery were fluid, when alchemical knowledge and mystical understanding were considered complementary rather than contradictory approaches to comprehending the fundamental forces that governed existence. The discovery of the Lazarus pits that would grant him effective immortality occurred during his youth, when a combination of scientific curiosity and desperate circumstances led him to investigate geological formations that local populations had long considered sacred and dangerous. The chemical properties of these naturally occurring pools of mineral-rich water were beyond the understanding of contemporary science, yet their effects on living tissue were undeniably miraculous, capable of healing injuries that should have been fatal, while also extending life far beyond normal human limitations. The first resurrection that Raz experienced after drowning in one of these mystical pools was both revelation and transformation, demonstrating not only the pit's power to restore life, but also their capacity to alter consciousness in ways that would fundamentally change his understanding of his own purpose and place in the cosmic order. The visions that accompanied his return from death provided him with perspectives on human history and planetary ecology that spanned centuries and encompassed civilizations that had not yet been born. The gradual realization that he had been granted effective immortality was accompanied by an equally profound understanding that this gift carried with it responsibilities that transcended normal human concerns about personal survival and individual achievement. The extended lifespan that the Lazarus pits had provided him meant that he would witness the consequences of human actions across time frames that normal mortals could never comprehend, seeing patterns of growth, decay, and renewal that were invisible to beings whose lives lasted mere decades. The philosophical transformation that occurred during Ra's first centuries of extended life was gradual but inexorable. As he observed the cyclical nature of human civilization and began to recognize what he perceived as fundamental flaws in the species' relationship with their planetary environment, the wars, famines, plagues, and ecological disasters that he witnessed were not random tragedies, but predictable consequences of human nature, operating without sufficient wisdom or restraint to prevent catastrophic outcomes. The organization that would become known as the League of Assassins began as a scholarly society dedicated to preserving knowledge and wisdom across the centuries, gathering information about scientific discoveries, philosophical insights, and practical skills that might otherwise be lost as civilizations collapsed and reformed. The recruitment of like-minded individuals who shared Ra's long-term perspective and commitment to human improvement created a network of immortal or near-immortal operatives whose influence extended across continents and centuries. The gradual militarization of the League occurred as Ra's philosophy evolved from passive observation and knowledge preservation to active intervention in human affairs. Based on his growing conviction that the species' inherent tendencies towards short-term thinking and destructive behavior could only be corrected through external guidance and, when necessary, forceful correction of developmental paths that threatened long-term survival. The assassination techniques that became the League's signature methods were developed not from sadistic impulses or criminal motivations, but from utilitarian calculations about the most efficient ways to eliminate individuals whose actions posed threats to broader human welfare or planetary stability. The deaths they caused were intended not as punishments but as surgical interventions designed to redirect historical processes that were heading toward catastrophic outcomes. The centuries of observation and intervention that shaped Ra's worldview provided him with a perspective on human development that was both comprehensive and deeply pessimistic, as he witnessed repeated patterns of technological advancement paired with moral stagnation, creating scenarios where increasingly powerful civilizations remained driven by the same primitive instincts and selfish motivations that had characterized their ancestors, but with vastly greater capacity for causing irreversible damage. The environmental consciousness that became central to Ra's mission developed gradually as he observed the cumulative effects of human industrial activity across multiple centuries, witnessing the transformation of pristine wilderness into polluted wasteland, the extinction of species that had survived for millions of years, and the alteration of planetary climate systems through activities that prioritized immediate profit over long-term sustainability. The mathematical calculations that convinced Raz that voluntary human behavioral change was impossible were based on statistical analysis of historical patterns spanning millennia, demonstrating that technological civilizations inevitably consumed their environmental resources faster than they could develop sustainable alternatives, leading to societal collapse that caused enormous suffering while also destroying accumulated knowledge and cultural achievements. The conclusion that forced population reduction was necessary to prevent complete ecological collapse was reached through careful analysis of carrying capacity, resource consumption rates, and environmental regeneration cycles, creating a logical framework that justified massive loss of human life as an unfortunate but necessary step toward ensuring the long-term survival of both the species and the planetary ecosystem that supported all life. The selection of Gotham City as a test site for his population reduction theories was based on extensive research into urban centers that exhibited the most severe symptoms of human civilization's structural problems: extreme wealth inequality, systematic corruption of institutions, environmental degradation, and social fragmentation that made voluntary cooperation and reform virtually impossible. Gotham represented humanity's failures in concentrated form, making it an ideal laboratory for testing solutions that could later be applied on a global scale. The plan that Raz developed for Gotham's destruction was elegant in its simplicity and horrific in its implications, involving the introduction of weaponized plague organisms into the city's water supply, followed by psychological warfare designed to trigger social breakdown that would accelerate the spread of disease while preventing organized response or evacuation efforts. The timeline for implementation was carefully calculated to ensure maximum lethality while minimizing the risk of containment that might prevent the experiment from reaching completion. The biological weapons that would serve as the primary instruments of Gotham's destruction were developed through centuries of research into disease organisms and their effects on human populations, incorporating knowledge gained from studying historical plagues, while also utilizing modern genetic engineering techniques to create pathogens that were specifically designed to overcome contemporary medical countermeasures and public health protocols. The psychological component of the attack was based on Ra's deep understanding of urban sociology and crowd psychology, utilizing economic manipulation, media disinformation, and targeted assassination of key civic leaders to create conditions of panic and social breakdown that would prevent effective response to the biological attack, while also ensuring that survivors would be too weakened and disorganized to rebuild their civilization along the same destructive patterns. The infiltration network that Raz established within Gotham's institutions was built over decades of patient recruitment and placement, identifying individuals whose personal circumstances and psychological profiles made them susceptible to the League's philosophy, while also providing them with positions of influence that could be leveraged when the time came to implement the destruction plan. The corruption of civic institutions that characterized Gotham actually facilitated this infiltration by creating opportunities for individuals with hidden agendas to achieve positions of trust and authority. The timeline for the attack was coordinated with global operations designed to ensure that Gotham's destruction would serve as the opening phase of a worldwide population reduction campaign rather than an isolated incident that might be contained and studied by surviving governments and scientific institutions. The simultaneity of multiple attacks was essential to preventing the kind of organized international response that might develop effective countermeasures or mount successful resistance to the League's objectives. The economic warfare that preceded the biological attack was designed to weaken Gotham's social infrastructure while also creating the psychological conditions necessary for rapid social breakdown when the plague began claiming lives. The manipulation of financial markets, the corruption of supply chains, and the systematic undermining of employment systems created stress fractures in the urban ecosystem that would propagate quickly once the primary assault began. The recruitment of local criminals and corrupt officials to serve as unwitting agents of the League's plan was accomplished through carefully constructed scenarios that made participation seem like ordinary criminal activity rather than collaboration in genocide, ensuring that most participants would not understand the true scope of the operation until it was too late to prevent or expose the planned destruction. The manufacturing facilities that produced the biological weapons were disguised as legitimate pharmaceutical research installations, utilizing the cover of drug development and medical research to mask activities that were actually focused on weaponizing disease organisms for mass casualty attacks. The scientific personnel who worked on these projects were compartmentalized to prevent any individual from understanding the full scope of the weapons development program. The distribution system that would introduce the plague organisms into Gotham's population was integrated with existing infrastructure in ways that made detection virtually impossible until symptoms began appearing throughout the city, utilizing water treatment facilities, food processing plants, and public transportation systems as vectors for biological contamination that would reach every neighborhood and demographic group simultaneously. The medical countermeasures that might have prevented or contained the outbreak were systematically compromised through the infiltration of hospitals, research institutions, and government health agencies, ensuring that when the attack began, the response would be delayed, misdirected, and ultimately ineffective in preventing the loss of life that Ra's plan required to achieve its objectives. The psychological profile of Batman that Ra's developed through years of study and direct observation revealed both the potential threat that the vigilante represented to the League's plans and the possibility that he might be recruited to serve their cause, if approached correctly, leading to elaborate schemes designed to test his moral flexibility and willingness to accept necessary sacrifices in service of greater goods. The relationship between Ra's and his daughter Talia was complicated by her genuine affection for Batman and her growing doubts about the necessity and morality of the League's methods, creating internal conflict within the organization that threatened to compromise operational security while also providing Ra's with insights into the psychological vulnerabilities that might be exploited to neutralize the Batman's opposition to their plans. The moment when Batman discovered the true scope of Ra's plans for Gotham marked the beginning of a philosophical conflict that transcended simple heroics and villainy to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of justice, the value of individual human life versus species survival, and the moral authority necessary to make decisions that would affect the future evolution of civilization on a planetary scale. The confrontation that followed Batman's infiltration of the League's operations forced both men to articulate their competing visions of human potential and planetary stewardship, with Ra's arguing that voluntary behavioral change was impossible given historical evidence, while Batman maintained that individuals possessed the capacity for growth and moral development that made coercive solutions both unnecessary and counterproductive. The battle for Gotham's survival became a test case for these competing philosophies, with Ra's centuries of planning and resource accumulation matched against Batman's intimate knowledge of the city and his ability to inspire others to overcome their limitations and work together despite the social, economic divisions that normally prevented effective cooperation. The failure of Ra's initial assault on Gotham was not merely a tactical defeat, but a challenge to the fundamental assumptions that had guided his activities for centuries, forcing him to reconsider whether human nature was as immutable as his observations had suggested, and whether the capacity for positive change might be greater than his mathematical models had predicted. The ongoing conflict between Ra's and Batman represented more than personal animosity or competing methodologies, encompassing instead a cosmic debate about the relationship between individual agency and historical necessity, the possibility of reform versus the inevitability of collapse, and the moral authority required to make decisions about the future of human civilization. The environmental crisis that motivated Ra's extreme methods continued to worsen despite his failure to implement population reduction in Gotham, validating his concerns about planetary sustainability, while also demonstrating the inadequacy of genocidal solutions to problems that required sustained cooperation and voluntary behavioral change across entire populations. The League of Assassins' continued operations following the failure of the Gotham attack reflected Ra's unwillingness to abandon his core mission despite tactical setbacks, leading to refined strategies that sought to achieve population reduction through more subtle methods that would be less likely to provoke organized resistance from heroes and governments committed to preserving current civilization patterns. The philosophical legacy of Ra's al Ghul's environmental extremism served as a permanent reminder that genuine concern for planetary welfare could be corrupted into justification for the most horrific crimes when it was divorced from respect for individual human dignity and the possibility that consciousness itself might be the universe's most precious and irreplaceable achievement, worthy of preservation, even at the cost of accepting imperfection and risk. In the broader context of Gotham's struggle against various forms of evil and corruption, Ra's al Ghul represented perhaps the most seductive and dangerous form of villainy because his motivations were genuinely altruistic and his methods were supported by logical analysis and historical evidence, making him an opponent who could not be dismissed as simply evil, but had to be confronted as someone whose love for the planet had been transformed into hatred for the species that threatened its stability and beauty through their inability to transcend their primitive instincts and short-term thinking patterns. In the shadowed realm where childhood wonder transforms into adult obsession, and the innocent games of youth become instruments of psychological domination, there exists a figure whose very appearance evokes the disturbing intersection of harmless eccentricity and profound mental illness. Jervis Tetch, known throughout Gotham's criminal underworld and the corridors of Arkham Asylum as the Mad Hatter, represents perhaps the most insidious form of evil that the human mind can conceive: the complete subjugation of free will through technological manipulation disguised as whimsical fantasy and literary appreciation. The man who would become one of Batman's most psychologically dangerous adversaries began his existence as a brilliant neuroscientist, whose early work in behavioral psychology and cognitive manipulation had earned him recognition from the most prestigious research institutions in the world. His doctoral dissertation on the neurochemical basis of decision-making processes had broken new ground in understanding how external stimuli could influence human behavior, providing insights that promised revolutionary applications in treating mental illness and addiction disorders. Yet beneath the facade of legitimate scientific inquiry lay a personality disorder so profound that it had escaped detection throughout Tetch's academic career. Hidden behind his genuine intellectual achievements and his apparent dedication to helping others overcome psychological limitations that prevented them from achieving their full potential. The obsessive tendencies that would eventually consume his entire existence manifested initially as an unusually intense interest in Victorian literature, particularly the works of Lewis Carroll that seemed to speak to something deep and disturbing in his developing psyche. The fixation on Alice's adventures in Wonderland that would define Tetch's criminal career began as what appeared to be harmless, scholarly interest in the psychological symbolism embedded within Carroll's narrative, yet gradually evolved into something far more sinister, as Tetch began to identify personally with the Mad Hatter character, and to view the fictional Wonderland as a superior form of reality, where logic and social convention were replaced by imagination and personal desire. The neurological research that provided the foundation for Tetch's mind control technology was originally developed for therapeutic purposes, designed to help patients overcome phobias, addictions, and compulsive behaviors by providing external regulation of brain chemistry and neural activity patterns. The electronic devices he created were marvels of miniaturization and precision, capable of monitoring and modifying specific aspects of cognitive function without causing detectable changes in personality or consciousness that might alert subjects to their manipulation. The transition from legitimate therapeutic research to criminal application began when Tetch realized that the same technologies that could help patients overcome destructive behavior patterns could also be used to induce desired behaviors in unwilling subjects, effectively transforming free-willed individuals into programmable automatons whose actions would be determined entirely by his preferences and instructions, rather than their own conscious choices. The first subjects of Tetch's unauthorized human experimentation were recruited from vulnerable populations who would not be missed if they disappeared, or whose behavioral changes would be attributed to existing mental health conditions rather than external manipulation. Homeless individuals, chronic psychiatric patients, and social outcasts became unwilling participants in research programs that violated every ethical principle governing scientific investigation, while also demonstrating the terrifying effectiveness of Tetch's mind control systems. The technology that enabled Tetch's crimes against human autonomy was concealed within seemingly innocent accessories that reflected his obsession with Victorian fashion and Lewis Carroll's literary creations. The top hats, pocket watches, and teacups that served as his signature props contained sophisticated electronic components capable of transmitting precisely calibrated electromagnetic signals that could alter brain chemistry and neural activity patterns in ways that made resistance impossible for affected individuals. The psychological satisfaction that Tetch derived from his ability to control others' minds went far beyond simple criminal opportunism or desire for power, touching something deeper and more disturbing in his fractured psyche. The complete submission of his victims to his will provided him with a form of validation and acceptance that normal human relationships had never offered, creating artificial communities where he was loved and respected rather than feared and avoided. The recruitment methods that Tetch employed to acquire subjects for his mind control experiments combined sophisticated psychological profiling with technological monitoring systems that allowed him to identify individuals whose personal circumstances and mental vulnerabilities made them ideal candidates for his particular form of enslavement. The data he collected through electronic surveillance and social media analysis provided him with detailed psychological profiles that enabled precise targeting of manipulation techniques. The children who became Tetch's preferred victims were selected not randomly, but according to specific criteria that made them particularly vulnerable to his control systems, while also satisfying his twisted desire to create perfect replicas of the characters from Carol's stories. Young girls with blonde hair and blue eyes were especially prized as potential Alice figures, while boys who exhibited curiosity and intelligence could be transformed into various supporting characters from his favorite literary fantasies. The kidnapping operations that supplied Tetch with victims for his Wonderland experiments were conducted with the same precision and attention to detail that had characterized his legitimate scientific research, utilizing advanced surveillance technology and careful behavioral analysis to identify optimal timing and methods for acquiring targets without detection by law enforcement or concerned family members. The processing facilities where Tetch conducted his mind control experiments were designed to replicate the aesthetic and atmosphere of Victorian England as interpreted through Carol's literary imagination, creating environments where reality and fantasy became indistinguishable, and where victims' psychological resistance could be broken down through systematic exposure to controlled hallucinations and sensory manipulation. The electronic devices that were surgically implanted in victims' brains were so sophisticated and miniaturized that they could operate for years without detection, providing Tetch with permanent control over subjects' behavior patterns, while also allowing him to monitor their thoughts and emotional responses through remote sensing systems that transmitted data to his central command facility. The behavioral modification programs that transformed kidnapping victims into willing participants in Tetch's twisted fantasies combined classical conditioning techniques with direct neural stimulation, creating artificial personality patterns that replace subjects' original identities with character templates derived from Carol's stories and Tetch's personal interpretations of how those characters should behave. The tea parties that served as both recreational activities and psychological conditioning sessions for Tetch's controlled victims were elaborate theatrical productions where every element was carefully designed to reinforce the Dacian's alternative reality he had created, from the costumes and dialogue to the food and beverages that contained additional mind-altering substances designed to enhance the effectiveness of his electronic control systems. The families who lost children to Tetch's kidnapping operations faced unique forms of psychological torture as they occasionally glimpsed their loved ones in public settings where the victims appeared happy and content, but completely unresponsive to attempts at communication or rescue, creating the horrifying realization that their children were still alive, but no longer truly existed as independent conscious beings. The law enforcement investigations that attempted to track Tetch's activities were frustrated by the sophisticated nature of his operations and his ability to use his controlled victims as unwitting agents who could gather intelligence about police procedures while also serving as sources of misdirection and false information designed to protect his primary facilities and ongoing experiments. The psychological evaluation of victims who were recovered from Tetch's control revealed the extent of the neurological damage caused by prolonged exposure to his mind control technology, with many subjects experiencing permanent alterations to personality, memory, and cognitive function that made their reintegration into normal social relationships extremely difficult or impossible. The medical treatment required to reverse the effects of Tetch's mind control systems was complicated by the sophisticated nature of the neural modifications he had implemented, requiring surgical procedures to remove implanted devices, while also addressing the psychological trauma caused by months or years of having their free will completely suppressed and their personal identity systematically destroyed. The children who survived their captivity in Tetch's Wonderland faced particular challenges in recovery, as their developing minds had been shaped by artificial experiences and conditioned responses that made it difficult for them to distinguish between memories of their real lives and the fantasy scenarios that had been imposed upon them through technological manipulation and psychological conditioning. The support groups that were established to help survivors and their families cope with the aftermath of Tetch's crimes provided forums for sharing experiences and developing coping strategies, though the unique nature of the trauma made it difficult to apply conventional therapeutic approaches designed for victims of more traditional forms of abuse and exploitation. The research community's response to the revelation of Tetch's experiments included extensive review of ethical protocols governing neuroscientific research and the development of new safeguards designed to prevent legitimate brain research from being perverted into instruments of psychological control and human rights violations. The technology companies that had unknowingly provided components for Tetch's mind control devices faced scrutiny regarding their responsibility for monitoring the applications of their products and reporting suspicious purchasing patterns that might indicate criminal misuse of advanced electronic systems designed for legitimate medical and research purposes. The legal proceedings that followed Tetch's capture were complicated by questions about the criminal responsibility of his controlled victims, who had been forced to participate in kidnapping operations and other illegal activities, while under the influence of his mind control technology, raising unprecedented issues about coercion and free will in criminal justice contexts. The prison security measures required to contain Tetch safely included electronic shielding to prevent him from using concealed devices to influence guards and fellow inmates, while also requiring specialized training for personnel who might be exposed to his manipulation attempts through conventional psychological techniques that did not rely on technological assistance. The ongoing threat that Tetch represented even while incarcerated was demonstrated by his ability to recruit followers through correspondence and legal visits, using his understanding of human psychology to identify vulnerable individuals who could be manipulated into serving his interests without the technological aids that had enabled his previous crimes. The philosophical questions raised by Tetch's crimes touched on fundamental issues about the nature of consciousness, free will, and personal identity, challenging legal and ethical frameworks that assumed individual autonomy while demonstrating how technology could be used to eliminate the psychological foundations upon which human rights and moral responsibility were based. The scientific knowledge that Tetch had developed through his illegal experiments represented a Faustian bargain for the research community, as his discoveries about neural manipulation and behavioral control could potentially benefit millions of people suffering from mental illness, yet had been acquired through methods so unethical that utilizing the knowledge would constitute tacit approval of his crimes against human dignity. The victims who had been transformed into living dolls through Tetch's mind control technology faced the challenge of rebuilding their sense of self and personal agency after experiencing complete subjugation, requiring intensive therapy and social support to develop new identities that incorporated both their original personalities and their memories of captivity without being overwhelmed by either experience. The families who had been torn apart by Tetch's crimes struggled with complex emotions that combined relief at their loved ones' survival with grief for the people they had been before their capture, as the returning victims were simultaneously familiar and alien, recognizable yet fundamentally changed by their exposure to technological control and psychological manipulation. the security industry's response to Tetch's demonstrated ability to conceal sophisticated electronic devices within innocent-appearing objects included the development of new detection systems and screening procedures designed to identify concealed technology that might be used for criminal purposes. Though the miniaturization of electronic components made complete protection virtually impossible, the mental health community's understanding of dissociative disorders and identity fragmentation was significantly advanced by studying Tetch's victims, though the artificial nature of their psychological trauma created new categories of mental illness that required entirely new therapeutic approaches and treatment protocols. The educational institutions where Tetch had achieved his early success were forced to examine their role in creating individuals whose intellectual development had proceeded without corresponding moral growth, leading to enhanced screening procedures and ethical training designed to identify potentially dangerous researchers before they could gain access to sensitive technologies and vulnerable populations. The literature and media that had inspired Tetch's fantasies came under scrutiny from critics who argued that certain forms of fiction could serve as blueprints for criminal behavior when consumed by individuals with appropriate psychological vulnerabilities and technical capabilities, though defenders of artistic expression maintained that creative works should not be censored because of potential misinterpretation by mentally ill individuals. The long-term impact of Tetch's crimes on public trust in neuroscience research created obstacles for legitimate investigators whose work might benefit millions of people suffering from neurological and psychiatric conditions, as public fears about mind control technology made funding and volunteer recruitment significantly more difficult for ethical researchers. In the broader context of Gotham's struggle against various forms of criminal insanity, the Mad Hatter represented perhaps the most philosophically disturbing category of villain because his crimes struck at the very foundation of human consciousness and personal autonomy, transforming victims into living extensions of his will, while destroying their capacity for independent thought and emotional self-determination. The continuing presence of Tetch's influence in Gotham's criminal ecosystem, through disciples who had adopted his methods and technology that remained hidden throughout the city, served as a permanent reminder that some forms of evil could persist even after their original architects were captured or killed, creating ongoing threats that required constant vigilance and specialized countermeasures. The legacy of the Mad Hatter's assault on human consciousness stood as a warning about the potential for scientific knowledge to be perverted into instruments of absolute control, demonstrating how the same technologies that promised to liberate humanity from the limitations of mental illness and cognitive dysfunction could also be used to eliminate the very qualities that made human existence meaningful and morally significant. In the verdant shadows where nature's beauty conceals humanity's greatest environmental sins, where the boundary between protector and destroyer becomes as fluid as the chemical compounds that flow through industrial drainage systems, there dwells a consciousness that has transcended the normal limitations of human biology to become something simultaneously more and less than the species from which it emerged. Pamela Lillian Isley's transformation into the entity known as Poison Ivy represents not merely another tale of scientific accident, creating a costumed criminal, but rather a profound meditation on the relationship between human civilization and the natural world, a story that begins with legitimate environmental concern and evolves into a genocidal vision that would eliminate humanity entirely in service of what she perceives as a higher form of life. The woman who would become one of Gotham's most dangerous eco-terrorists began her existence as a brilliant botanist whose early research into plant biochemistry and environmental toxicology had earned her recognition as one of the leading experts in her field. Her doctoral work on the defensive mechanisms employed by various plant species against environmental threats had revealed sophisticated chemical systems that far exceeded anything developed by human pharmaceutical research, suggesting possibilities for medical applications that could revolutionize treatment for diseases that had plagued humanity for millennia. The passion that drove Pamela's scientific career was rooted not in abstract intellectual curiosity, but in genuine love for the natural world and deep concern about the accelerating pace of environmental destruction that characterized contemporary industrial civilization. Her research expeditions to endangered ecosystems around the world had provided her with first-hand knowledge of the devastation caused by human activities, creating emotional connections to threatened species and habitats that went far beyond professional interest in botanical phenomena. The transformation that would alter both her physiology and her relationship to human society occurred during what should have been a routine research project, investigating the biochemical properties of rare plant species that were facing extinction due to habitat destruction and climate change. The experimental procedures she was conducting involved direct exposure to concentrated plant toxins and growth hormones that were designed to enhance her understanding of how these organisms adapted to environmental stress. The accident that changed Pamela's fundamental nature was not a single catastrophic event, but rather the result of prolonged exposure to exotic biochemical compounds that gradually altered her cellular structure and neurochemistry in ways that created a hybrid organism combining human consciousness with plant-based physiological systems. The changes were so gradual that she initially attributed her increased sensitivity to environmental conditions and her growing emotional attachment to plant life as natural consequences of her intensive research focus. The first manifestation of her transformation into something beyond normal human biology was the development of immunity to virtually all known toxins and poisons, as her modified cellular structure learned to process and neutralize chemical compounds that would have been lethal to ordinary humans. This capability was accompanied by the ability to produce and secrete various plant-derived toxins through her skin, creating a natural defense system that made physical contact with her potentially fatal to anyone lacking similar immunity. The psychological changes that accompanied her physical transformation were more subtle but ultimately more significant, as Pamela's emotional connection to plant life deepened into something approaching telepathic communication with the botanical organisms that surrounded her. The suffering of damaged ecosystems became personal pain that she experienced as intensely as if her own body were being harmed, while the death of individual plants registered as genuine grief, comparable to the loss of close friends or family members. The philosophical evolution that transformed environmental concern into genocidal extremism occurred gradually as Pamela's enhanced connection to plant consciousness provided her with perspectives on human civilization that normal people could never access. From the viewpoint of organisms that measured time in centuries rather than decades, human industrial activity appeared not as necessary economic development, but as catastrophic destruction that threatened the survival of complex ecosystems that had taken millions of years to develop. The research facility that Pamela established after her transformation served multiple functions as both legitimate botanical laboratory and weapons development center, where her scientific expertise was applied to creating biological agents that could serve her evolving mission to protect plant life by eliminating the human threats that endangered it. The greenhouse complexes that housed her work were marvels of biotechnology that pushed the boundaries of what was possible in controlled botanical environments. The plant specimens that filled her laboratory were not merely research subjects, but conscious allies whose biochemical capabilities could be enhanced and weaponized. through selective breeding and genetic modification techniques that combined traditional botanical knowledge with cutting-edge biotechnology. The orchids that produced airborne psychoactive compounds, the vines that could strangle human victims while remaining perfectly harmless to other plant species, and the flowers that released targeted toxins based on specific human pheromone signatures, represented years of careful cultivation and experimentation. The seductive powers that became Poison Ivy's signature weapon were based on sophisticated understanding of human neurochemistry and behavioral psychology, utilizing plant-derived pheromones and psychoactive compounds that could override rational thought processes and moral inhibitions in ways that made her victims willing participants in their own destruction. The kiss that delivered these chemical cocktails became both her calling card and her most effective method for eliminating those who threatened her botanical allies. The environmental scientists who became her early targets were selected not because they were enemies of nature, but because their research and conservation efforts were, in her transformed perspective, inadequate responses to existential threats that required far more dramatic action. The irony that she was murdering people who shared her concerns about environmental destruction was lost on her altered consciousness, which had moved beyond human-centered thinking to embrace perspectives that treated individual human lives as acceptable casualties in a larger war for planetary survival. The plan that Ivy developed for the systematic elimination of human civilization was both elegant and horrifying in its scope, involving the coordinated release of plant-based biological weapons that would target specific aspects of human physiology while leaving other forms of life completely unharmed. The timeline for implementation was measured in seasons rather than months, reflecting her adoption of plant-based temporal perspectives that viewed immediate human suffering as irrelevant compared to long-term ecological benefits. The botanical weapons that would serve as the primary instruments of human extinction were designed to exploit fundamental vulnerabilities in human biology that plants had been defending against for millions of years, creating toxins and allergens that could overwhelm immune systems and cause systematic organ failure through mechanisms that conventional medicine would be unprepared to counteract. The beauty of these weapons lay in their apparent naturalness, as they would appear to be evolutionary responses rather than deliberate attacks. The distribution system that would spread these biological agents throughout human populations was integrated with existing agricultural and horticultural networks, utilizing the global trade in flowers, fruits, and decorative plants to carry engineered organisms into every major population center simultaneously. The timing was coordinated with seasonal growing patterns that would ensure maximum dispersal during periods when human contact with plant materials was most frequent and extensive. The recruitment network that Ivy established to support her genocidal campaign included both willing collaborators who shared her environmental extremism and unwilling agents who had been chemically conditioned through exposure to her pheromones and toxins. The botanical researchers, environmental activists, and agricultural workers who became part of her organization often had no conscious knowledge of their role in facilitating mass murder, believing themselves to be participants in legitimate conservation efforts. The psychological conditioning that Ivy employed to create devoted followers combined her natural seductive abilities with systematic exposure to plant-derived psychoactive compounds that gradually altered personality and moral reasoning in ways that made environmental protection the supreme value that overrode all considerations of human welfare or individual rights. The transformation of normal people into eco-terrorists was so gradual that subjects rarely recognized the extent of their psychological manipulation. The children who were exposed to Ivy's influence during school field trips and educational programs about environmental conservation became unwitting carriers of biological agents, designed to spread through family units and social networks, turning innocent educational activities into vectors for biological warfare. The integration of her weapons with legitimate environmental education made detection virtually impossible until symptoms began appearing in affected populations. The urban parks and botanical gardens that served as Ivy's primary bases of operations were transformed into staging areas for biological warfare, while maintaining their public function as recreational and educational facilities, allowing her to conduct weapons testing and agent training under cover of normal horticultural activities. The visitors who enjoyed these green spaces had no idea that they were being systematically exposed to experimental biological agents. The government agencies responsible for environmental protection and public health became targets for infiltration, as Ivy recognized that preventing effective response to her biological attack would require corruption or elimination of the proof institutional infrastructure that might otherwise coordinate countermeasures. The regulatory officials and public health experts who disappeared or suffered apparent accidents were actually victims of targeted assassination campaigns. The agricultural systems that fed major population centers were systematically compromised through the introduction of modified plant species that appeared identical to normal food crops, but contained genetic modifications that would produce toxic compounds when exposed to specific environmental triggers that Ivy could control remotely. The contamination of food supplies provided her with the capability to cause mass casualties without requiring direct distribution of biological weapons. The medical research facilities that might have developed treatments for plant-based toxins were targeted for destruction or infiltration, ensuring that when her biological weapons began claiming lives, the healthcare systems would be unprepared to provide effective treatment or develop countermeasures that could limit the death toll. The elimination of botanical expertise from medical institutions was accomplished through targeted recruitment and assassination campaigns. The environmental monitoring systems that might have detected unusual patterns in plant behavior or atmospheric composition were disabled or corrupted through cyber attacks and physical sabotage, creating blind spots in humanity's ability to recognize and respond to the biological warfare campaign that Ivy was conducting through apparently natural environmental processes. The timeline for human extinction that Ivy envisioned was measured in decades rather than years, reflecting her understanding that sustainable elimination of human civilization required careful management to prevent ecological damage that might result from sudden collapse of industrial systems or mass die-offs that could create environmental contamination from decaying human populations. The post-human world that Ivy planned to create would be characterized by the complete dominance of plant life over terrestrial ecosystems, with surviving animal species serving roles as pollinators and seed dispersers in biological networks that would be far more complex and stable than the human-dominated systems they replaced. The elimination of human agricultural and industrial activities would allow natural plant communities to reclaim territories that had been lost to development and cultivation. The discovery of Ivy's genocidal plans occurred through Batman's investigation of unusual patterns in environmental crime and ecological terrorism, leading to the gradual recognition that what appeared to be separate incidents of eco-extremism were actually components of a coordinated campaign aimed at eliminating human life from Earth entirely. The scope of her planning and the sophistication of her biological weapons exceeded anything that law enforcement agencies had previously encountered. The confrontation that followed Batman's infiltration of Ivy's operations forced both adversaries to articulate their competing visions of environmental protection and species survival, with Ivy arguing that human extinction was necessary to prevent ecological collapse, while Batman maintained that cooperation between humans and nature was possible if people could be educated and motivated to change their destructive behaviors. The battle for Gotham's survival became a test case for these competing approaches to environmental crisis, with Ivy's biological weapons designed to demonstrate the futility of technological solutions to ecological problems, while Batman's countermeasures sought to prove that human ingenuity and moral development could overcome even the most severe environmental challenges. The failure of Ivy's initial assault on human civilization was not merely a tactical defeat, but a challenge to her fundamental belief that humans were incapable of changing their destructive relationship with the natural world, forcing her to reconsider whether education and persuasion might be more effective than extinction in achieving genuine environmental protection. The ongoing conflict between Ivy and those who sought to prevent human extinction represented more than personal animosity or competing methodologies, encompassing instead a philosophical debate about the value of human consciousness versus ecological stability, the possibility of sustainable civilization versus the inevitability of environmental collapse, and the moral authority required to make decisions about the future of life on Earth. The environmental crisis that motivated Ivy's extreme methods continued to worsen despite her failure to implement human extinction, validating her concerns about planetary sustainability, while also demonstrating the inadequacy of genocidal solutions to problems that required sustained cooperation and voluntary behavioral change across entire populations and economic systems. The botanical weapons that Ivy had developed for her genocide campaign remained viable even after her capture, creating ongoing security concerns. As other eco-extremists attempted to acquire and deploy biological agents that could cause mass casualties while appearing to be natural phenomena rather than deliberate attacks on human populations, the psychological impact of learning that someone with legitimate environmental credentials had been planning the systematic elimination of human civilization created lasting trauma for communities that had trusted environmental activists and supported conservation efforts, challenging assumptions about the relationship between environmental concern and human welfare. The scientific knowledge that Ivy had developed through her research into plant biochemistry and toxicology represented valuable insights that could benefit both environmental protection and medical treatment. Yet her criminal application of this knowledge made it difficult for legitimate researchers to build upon her discoveries without appearing to endorse her genocidal methods. The legacy of Poison Ivy's assault on human civilization served as a permanent reminder that genuine environmental concern could be corrupted into justification for the most horrific crimes when it was divorced from respect for human consciousness and the possibility that intelligence itself might be the universe's most precious achievement, worthy of preservation, even at the cost of accepting some degree of environmental risk and imperfection. In the broader context of Gotham's struggle against various forms of extremism and criminal insanity, Poison Ivy represented perhaps the most philosophically challenging form of villainy because her environmental concerns were legitimate and her scientific analysis of ecological threats was largely accurate, making her an opponent who could not be dismissed as simply evil, but had to be confronted as someone whose love for nature had been transformed into hatred for the species that threatened its survival through their inability to transcend their destructive instincts and short-term thinking, patterns that prioritized immediate economic benefit over long-term ecological sustainability. In the quiet corridors of human psychology, where trauma festers in darkness and the mind constructs elaborate defenses against unbearable reality, there exists perhaps no more tragic figure than the gentle soul who found himself transformed into an instrument of violence through the fragmenting of his own consciousness. Arnold Wesker's story represents the most heartbreaking category of criminal pathology. Not evil chosen, but madness imposed. Not malice cultivated, but innocence shattered beyond repair by circumstances that no human psyche should be forced to endure. The man who would become known as the ventriloquist began his existence as everything that civilized society claimed to value: quiet, polite, hard-working, and possessed of the kind of fundamental decency that made him beloved by neighbors, respected by colleagues, and trusted by everyone who encountered his gentle demeanor and unfailing courtesy. His childhood had been marked not by the dramatic traumas that characterized many of Gotham's criminals, but by the subtler poison of perfectionism and suppressed anger that created psychological fault lines invisible to casual observation. Arnold's employment at a small accounting firm represented the fulfillment of modest ambitions and reflected his natural aptitude for detail work that required patience and precision rather than aggression or dominance. His colleagues knew him as someone who never raised his voice, never complained about overtime, and never seemed to experience the normal frustrations that affected other workers when dealing with difficult clients or demanding deadlines. This supernatural calmness was not serenity, but rather the result of decades of psychological conditioning that had taught him to suppress all negative emotions rather than risk the disapproval that conflict might generate. The traumatic event that would shatter Arnold's carefully constructed psychological defenses occurred during what should have been an ordinary workday, when armed robbers invaded his office building and took the entire staff hostage during a robbery that quickly escalated into a prolonged siege. The violence that he witnessed during those terrible hours included the systematic torture and execution of co-workers who had committed no crime beyond the accident of being present when criminals decided to demonstrate their power through the infliction of suffering on innocent people. The particular horror that Arnold experienced was not merely witnessing violence, but being forced to participate in it, as the robbers used psychological pressure and threats against other hostages to compel him to make choices about who would live and who would die. The gentleman who had spent his entire life avoiding conflict found himself in situations where any decision he made would result in the death of people he cared about, creating impossible moral burdens that his psyche was completely unprepared to bear. The psychological breakdown that followed Arnold's rescue from the hostage situation manifested initially as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, with symptoms including flashbacks, nightmares, and panic attacks that made normal social interaction impossible. Yet beneath these visible signs of trauma, more profound changes were occurring, as his mind struggled to process experiences that violated every assumption he had held about human nature, moral order, and his own capacity to make ethical decisions under pressure. The emergence of an alternate personality that could contain and express the rage and guilt that Arnold's original consciousness could not acknowledge was a psychological survival mechanism that initially seemed to provide relief from his symptoms. The voice that began speaking through him during therapy sessions was harsh, aggressive, and completely unlike his normal, gentle demeanor, yet it allowed him to articulate feelings and experiences that his primary personality found too overwhelming to confront directly. The puppet that would become known as Mr. Scarface was discovered by Arnold in a toy store where he had gone seeking comfort items that might help him cope with his ongoing psychological distress. The wooden figure's gangster appearance and permanent scowl seemed to embody the angry, violent aspects of human nature that Arnold had always tried to deny or suppress, making it the perfect vessel for the alternate personality that was struggling to emerge from his fractured psyche. The relationship that developed between Arnold and his puppet was not the simple ventriloquism that outside observers assumed. but rather a complex psychological phenomenon, where the wooden figure served as both externalized conscience and repository for memories and emotions that were too traumatic for his primary personality to integrate. The voice that spoke through Scarface was Arnold's own, yet it expressed thoughts and feelings that seemed completely alien to his gentle nature. The criminal activities that began as Scarface gained control over Arnold's behavior were initially minor incidents of shoplifting and vandalism that reflected the alternate personality's need to assert dominance and express the brazen rage that had been building since the hostage situation. Yet these small crimes provided psychological relief that encouraged escalation, as each act of rebellion against social norms helped Arnold's fragmented psyche feel more powerful and less victimized. The transformation of petty crime into systematic violence occurred gradually as the Mr. Scarface personality became more sophisticated and began planning elaborate schemes that utilized Arnold's accounting skills and his intimate knowledge of business operations to identify targets and opportunities for more serious criminal activities. The combination of financial expertise and psychological instability created a unique form of criminal threat that law enforcement agencies were unprepared to address. The gang that formed around Arnold and his puppet reflected the bizarre nature of their criminal partnership, attracting other individuals with similar psychological disorders who found comfort in the clearly defined hierarchy that Scarface established through his domineering personality and Arnold's submissive compliance with the wooden figure's demand. The criminal organization that emerged was simultaneously highly effective and completely dysfunctional. The planning sessions that preceded major crimes were elaborate theatrical productions where Arnold would conduct conversations with his puppet while other gang members listened to instructions that were delivered through the wooden figure's permanently snarling mouth. The complexity of these schemes reflected genuine criminal intelligence, yet their execution was often compromised by the psychological instability that affected all participants in the organization. The bank robberies that established the ventriloquist's reputation in Gotham's criminal underworld were characterized by unusual attention to the emotional impact on victims, as Arnold's underlying empathy and desire to avoid causing unnecessary suffering created internal conflicts with Scarface's demands for ruthless efficiency and dramatic demonstration of power. These competing impulses resulted in crimes that were simultaneously compassionate and brutal. The hostage situations that arose during several of these robberies became reenactments of Arnold's original trauma, as he found himself once again in positions where he was forced to make decisions about other people's survival, while operating under extreme psychological pressure. The difference was that now he possessed the power to control outcomes, rather than simply being a helpless victim. Yet this authority only intensified his psychological distress. The murders that began occurring during the gang's criminal activities were not premeditated acts of violence, but rather the inevitable result of Arnold's psychological instability interacting with Scarface's aggressive demands, and the unpredictable nature of criminal operations that involved weapons and desperate people. Each death added to Arnold's burden of guilt, while simultaneously providing Scarface with evidence of their power and effectiveness. The innocent bystanders who became victims of the ventriloquist's crimes were often people who reminded Arnold of himself or his former colleagues, triggering psychological responses that caused the careful plans developed by Scarface to dissolve into chaotic violence that served no practical purpose beyond expressing the rage and guilt that consumed Arnold's fractured consciousness. The randomness of these attacks made them particularly terrifying for Gotham's civilian population. The employees of small businesses who found themselves facing robbery by the ventriloquist experienced unique forms of psychological trauma as they tried to understand whether they were being threatened by the quiet, apologetic man or the wooden puppet that seemed to control his actions. The bizarre nature of these encounters made it difficult for victims to process their experiences through normal frameworks for understanding criminal behavior. The police officers who attempted to negotiate with Arnold during standoff situations discovered that traditional hostage negotiation techniques were ineffective when dealing with someone whose decision-making process was mediated through conversations with an inanimate object that represented an alternate personality. The psychological complexity of these encounters exceeded the training that most law enforcement personnel had received for dealing with mentally ill criminals. The psychiatrists who evaluated Arnold after his capture faced unprecedented challenges in developing treatment plans for someone whose criminal behavior was genuinely beyond his conscious control, yet who remained legally responsible for crimes that had resulted in multiple deaths and significant trauma for surviving victims. The case raised fundamental questions about the nature of criminal responsibility and the adequacy of existing legal frameworks for addressing severe mental illness. The medication regimens that were developed to treat Arnold's dissociative disorder showed limited effectiveness because the psychological trauma that had created his alternate personality was too severe to be addressed through chemical intervention alone, while the symbolic relationship with his puppet had become so deeply embedded in his psychological structure that removing it threatened to cause complete psychological collapse. The therapy sessions that attempted to help Arnold integrate his fragmented personality were complicated by the fact that the Mr. Scarface persona served essential psychological functions that could not be eliminated without providing alternative mechanisms for processing trauma and expressing emotions that his primary personality found too overwhelming to acknowledge. The therapeutic process became a delicate balance between healing and psychological survival. The other inmates at Arkham Asylum who interacted with Arnold found themselves unsettled by the obvious sincerity of his remorse and the genuine nature of his psychological distress, as his case challenged their own understanding of the relationship between mental illness and criminal behavior. The presence of someone who was clearly both victim and perpetrator created philosophical complications that affected the entire therapeutic community. The family members of people who had been killed during the ventriloquist's criminal activities struggled with conflicting emotions about Arnold's obvious mental illness and the reality of their losses, finding it difficult to direct their anger towards someone who seemed to be as much a victim as a perpetrator, yet who had nonetheless caused irreversible harm through his actions regardless of his psychological condition. The legal precedents established by Arnold's case influenced subsequent prosecution of criminals with severe mental illness, creating new standards for evaluating criminal responsibility and appropriate sentencing for individuals whose actions were clearly influenced by psychological conditions beyond their conscious control, yet who posed ongoing threats to public safety that required institutional response. The security measures required to contain Arnold safely included provisions for preventing him from accessing materials that could be used to create new puppets or ventriloquist figures, as his psychological dependence on external objects to express his alternate personality made any inanimate figure a potential trigger for renewed criminal behavior. The restrictions necessary for public safety also complicated his therapeutic treatment. The research community's interest in Arnold's case as a unique example of dissociative identity disorder led to extensive study of his condition and its relationship to criminal behavior, contributing to better understanding of trauma-induced personality fragmentation while also raising ethical questions about using mentally ill criminals as research subjects without their informed consent. The popular culture impact of the ventriloquist case influenced public perceptions of mental illness and criminal responsibility, with media coverage focusing on the bizarre aspects of his crimes rather than the underlying trauma and psychological complexity that had created his condition. perpetuating stigma that made treatment and rehabilitation more difficult for other individuals with similar disorders. The ongoing threat that Arnold represented, even while receiving treatment, was demonstrated by episodes where he managed to acquire improvised puppet figures and briefly resumed the Mr. Scarface personality, showing that his psychological condition remained unstable and that public safety required continued institutional supervision, regardless of his obvious remorse and desire for recovery. The philosophical questions raised by Arnold's case extended beyond legal and medical considerations to encompass broader issues about the nature of personal identity, moral responsibility, and the social obligations owed to individuals whose mental illness makes them dangerous to others despite their lack of malicious intent or conscious choice to cause harm. The tragedy of the ventriloquist lay not in his crimes, however terrible their consequences, but in the waste of a fundamentally decent human being whose psychological destruction had been caused by witnessing and being forced to participate in violence that his gentle nature was completely unprepared to process, transforming a victim of trauma into a perpetrator of similar trauma through mechanisms that he could neither understand nor control. In the broader context of Gotham's struggle with criminal insanity and the complex relationship between mental illness and violent behavior, Arnold Wesker represented the most heartbreaking category of case. Someone who had been broken by evil rather than choosing it, whose crimes were symptoms of psychological damage rather than expressions of malicious intent, and whose story served as a reminder that society's failure to protect the vulnerable from trauma could create new forms of danger that threatened everyone's safety and security. The continuing presence of Arnold's case in Arkham's files and in the memories of those who had encountered his fractured personality served as a permanent reminder that evil could be created as well as chosen, that innocence could be weaponized against itself, and that the human psyche's capacity for survival could sometimes produce solutions that were more dangerous than the original problems they were designed to address. In the obsessive realm, where time becomes both prison and weapon, where the very passage of days and seasons transforms into an instrument of terror, there exists a mind so consumed by temporal patterns that it has perverted humanity's most sacred traditions into occasions for systematic murder. Julian Gregory Day, known throughout Gotham's criminal underworld as Calendar Man, represents perhaps the most methodical and psychologically disturbing form of serial killing ever documented, transforming the calendar itself into a blueprint for death that turns every holiday, anniversary, and significant date into a potential crime scene. The man who would become Calendar Man began his existence with what appeared to be an admirable attention to detail and an almost scholarly fascination with the historical significance of dates and their cultural meaning across different civilizations and religious traditions. His early career as a history professor had been marked by published research on the anthropological importance of seasonal celebrations and the psychological functions that ritual observances served in maintaining social cohesion, individual mental health. Julian's transformation from academic scholar to temporal terrorist was gradual, beginning with what seemed like harmless eccentricity about commemorating unusual historical anniversaries and evolving into dangerous obsession with the idea that modern society had lost touch with the profound significance that dates and seasons should hold in human consciousness. His increasing isolation from normal social relationships was both cause and consequence of his growing belief that most people were spiritually impoverished by their failure to properly observe the passage of time. The psychological profile that emerged from Julian's early criminal activities revealed a mind that had become completely dominated by temporal thinking, viewing all human behavior and social interaction through the lens of calendrical significance rather than normal emotional or practical considerations. His apartment was discovered to contain thousands of calendars from different cultures and historical periods, along with detailed charts tracking astronomical phenomena, religious observances, and historical anniversaries that most people had never heard of or forgotten entirely. The methodology that Julian developed for selecting his victims was based entirely on their symbolic relationship to specific dates rather than any personal connection to him or conventional criminal motivations like robbery or revenge. The people who died at his hands were chosen because their deaths on particular dates would create what he viewed as appropriate tributes to the historical or seasonal significance that those dates possessed in his elaborate temporal worldview. The planning process that preceded each murder was meticulous and scholarly, involving extensive research into the historical background of target dates, the biographical details of potential victims who could serve as appropriate symbolic offerings, and the development of murder methods that would reflect the cultural themes associated with particular celebrations or commemorations. Each crime was conceived as both homicide and historical reenactment. The first murder that established Julian's reputation as Calendar Man occurred on Halloween, when he selected a victim whose death would serve as what he considered a proper sacrifice to honor the ancient Celtic tradition of Samhain and its role as a boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. The elaborate ritual elements that surrounded the killing demonstrated his extensive knowledge of historical practices, while also revealing the depth of his psychological disconnection from normal human empathy. The weapons that Julian employed in his crimes were chosen for their historical authenticity rather than their efficiency, as he insisted on using implements and methods that would have been appropriate to the time periods and cultures associated with the dates he was commemorating. The medieval torture devices, ancient ceremonial blades, and traditional execution methods that filled his arsenal represented years of research and acquisition from museums, private collectors, and historical reproduction specialists. The locations where Julian conducted his murders were selected for their symbolic resonance with the dates being observed, leading him to commit crimes in churches during religious holidays, parks during seasonal celebrations, and historical sites during anniversary commemorations. The effort required to gain access to these venues, while avoiding detection, demonstrated both his intelligence and his complete dedication to maintaining the thematic integrity of his temporal murder campaign. The victims who found themselves targeted by Calendar Man experienced unique forms of psychological torture, as Julian would often kidnap them days or weeks before their scheduled deaths, using the intervening time to educate them about the historical significance of their impending demise and the honor they should feel at being selected to participate in proper observance of important dates. This forced education added layers of horror to already traumatic situations. The families of Julian's victims faced the additional trauma of having their losses forever associated with dates that should have been occasions for celebration and joy, as holidays and anniversaries became permanent reminders of their loved ones' deaths, rather than opportunities for happy memories and family traditions. The psychological impact of this temporal contamination extended far beyond the immediate grief of loss. The investigation challenges that Julian's crimes presented to law enforcement were unprecedented, as his victim selection criteria were so obscure and his methods so varied that traditional criminal profiling techniques were inadequate for predicting his next targets or preventing future attacks. The vast scope of potential significant dates meant that virtually every day of the year could trigger new violence. The media coverage of Calendar Man's crimes created additional problems, as news reports about his methods and motivations inadvertently provided him with the public attention and academic recognition that his damaged psyche craved, while also inspiring copycat criminals who began timing their own crimes to coincide with significant dates in hopes of achieving similar notoriety through temporal association. The law enforcement task force that was eventually assembled to investigate Julian's activities included historians, anthropologists, and religious scholars in addition to traditional criminal investigators, as understanding his temporal obsessions required expertise in fields that police departments had never before needed to address criminal behavior. The interdisciplinary approach was both innovative and frustratingly complex. The breakthrough that led to Julian's capture came through careful analysis of his research patterns, as investigators discovered that he had been systematically acquiring rare books and historical documents related to obscure celebrations and commemorative practices, creating a paper trail that revealed his areas of interest and allowed prediction of future target dates and victim profiles. The psychological evaluation that followed Julian's arrest revealed the full extent of his temporal fixation and its complete domination of his personality, as he proved incapable of discussing any topic without reference to its calendrical significance and seemed genuinely confused by the suggestion that his murders were inappropriate ways to honor historical events and cultural traditions. The trial that followed was complicated by Julian's obvious mental illness and his sincere belief that his crimes were acts of cultural preservation and historical education rather than murders, though his detailed planning and sophisticated methods demonstrated that he retained enough rational thinking ability to be held criminally responsible for his actions, despite his delusional motivations. The sentencing phase required careful consideration of the unique nature of Julian's crimes and their impact on entire communities whose celebrations and traditions had been contaminated by association with his violence, leading to innovative victim impact statements that addressed not only individual losses but broader cultural trauma affecting anyone who participated in the observances he had perverted. The security measures required for Julian's incarceration included removal of all calendars, clocks, and temporal references from his environment, as any awareness of dates or seasons could trigger renewed fixation on murder as appropriate observance, while also requiring constant monitoring by staff who were trained to recognize and interrupt the thought patterns that preceded his violent episodes. The ongoing threat that Julian represented, even while confined, was demonstrated by his ability to track time through subtle environmental cues and his attempts to recruit other inmates or staff members to carry out murders on significant dates when he could not personally conduct what he viewed as necessary observances, showing that his condition remained dangerous despite institutional treatment. The academic community's response to Julian's crimes included extensive discussion about the potential for historical and anthropological scholarship to be perverted into justification for violence, leading to new ethical guidelines for research into cultural practices that involved violence or sacrifice, while also examining whether academic obsession with historical accuracy could become pathological under certain circumstances. The religious communities whose holidays had been targeted by Julian's murder campaign faced challenges in helping their members reclaim positive associations with celebrations that had been contaminated by his violence, requiring innovative pastoral care approaches that addressed both individual trauma and collective religious identity that had been threatened by his perverted interpretations of sacred observances. The calendar and publishing industries experienced unexpected impacts from Julian's crimes as public demand decreased for detailed historical calendars and anniversary commemorations, while mental health professionals noted increased anxiety around holidays and significant dates among people who had been exposed to media coverage of his temporal murder methods. The research that emerged from studying Julian's case contributed to better understanding of obsessive-compulsive disorders and their potential to escalate into violent behavior, while also revealing the ways that intellectual interests and scholarly pursuits could become pathological when they replaced normal emotional and social development rather than complementing it. The cultural impact of Calendar Man's crimes extended beyond immediate victims to affect how entire communities approached the celebration of holidays and commemorative events, with many people reporting decreased enjoyment of traditional observances due to awareness that such occasions could serve as triggers for mentally ill individuals with temporal obsessions similar to Julian's condition. The law enforcement protocols that were developed in response to Julian's case included new procedures for monitoring individuals with unusual interests in historical violence or sacrificial practices, while also creating databases of significant dates and their potential for inspiring copycat crimes among individuals with similar psychological profiles and access to weapons or victims. The philosophical questions raised by Julian's crimes touched on fundamental issues about the relationship between historical knowledge and moral responsibility, the potential dangers of academic specialization that became disconnected from human empathy, and the ways that intellectual pursuits could be corrupted when they served psychological needs rather than genuine scholarly curiosity. The memorial services for Julian's victims required careful planning to avoid dates that might attract attention from other temporally obsessed criminals or that might reinforce the symbolic associations he had tried to create between their deaths and specific calendar observances, leading to new approaches to grief counseling that address the unique challenges of temporal trauma. The continuing influence of Julian's crimes on Gotham's cultural life was evident in the decreased participation in public celebrations and the increased security measures required for holiday events, as awareness of his methods created lasting anxiety about the potential for significant dates to serve as triggers for violence by mentally ill individuals with similar fixations. In the broader context of Gotham's struggle against various forms of criminal insanity, Calendar Man represented a unique category of threat that combined intellectual sophistication with complete moral blindness, creating crimes that were simultaneously planned and irrational, historically informed and utterly meaningless, scholarly and savage in their complete disregard for human dignity, and the right to celebrate cultural traditions without fear of violence. The legacy of Julian Day's temporal terrorism served as a permanent reminder that knowledge without wisdom could become dangerous, that obsession could corrupt even the most noble intellectual pursuits, and that the human mind's capacity for finding patterns and meaning could be perverted into justification for the most senseless violence. When mental illness eliminated the emotional and moral constraints that normally prevented scholarly interest from becoming homicidal compulsion. In the final shadows of our journey through Gotham's gallery of nightmares, we find ourselves confronted not merely with a catalogue of individual crimes, but with a mirror reflecting the deepest truths about the eternal struggle between light and darkness that defines the human condition. Each villain we have encountered represents not just an external threat but an internal possibility, a path that any consciousness might take when faced with trauma, disappointment, or the seductive whisper that power without restraint offers solutions that compassion and patience cannot provide. The Joker's meaningless violence, the Scarecrow's weaponized fear, the Penguin's respectable evil, the Riddler's intellectual cruelty, Two-Face's abandoned justice, Ra's al Ghul's genocidal environmentalism, the Mad Hatter's stolen autonomy, Poison Ivy's species hatred, the ventriloquist's fractured innocence, and Calendar Man's temporal obsessions all serve as cautionary tales about what we might become when we lose sight of our connection to others and our responsibility for the communities we inhabit. Yet in their darkest moments lies Batman's greatest triumph. The demonstration that even in a city where madness reigns and corruption flourishes, the choice to serve something greater than oneself remains possible. These rogues define him not through their evil, but through his refusal to become what they represent, his unwavering commitment to protection over domination, healing over harm, hope over despair. Rest now, guardian of tomorrow's dreams, knowing that even in darkness, the light of consciousness endures, and the eternal choice between creation and destruction awaits each new dawn.